Before we begin tonight's journey into one of history's most carefully hidden astronomical mysteries, I want to ask for your support in a few small ways that make a massive difference to this channel. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps more than you could possibly know and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dive documentaries. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us reach more listeners who love this kind of content. And here's something we always love seeing. Comment below what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to share. We absolutely love seeing our global community and where everyone tunes in from around the planet. Finally, if you enjoy what we do here, please consider subscribing. It costs nothing but means everything to our ability to keep creating. Before we dive in, I want to give a special thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this story idea. Your contribution helped make these stories possible, and we truly appreciate our community's input in shaping the content we create. Now, let's begin. The photograph was never supposed to leave the laboratory. Taken from a survey aircraft over the Guatemalan highlands in March of 1971, it showed what appeared to be a perfectly geometric arrangement of ancient structures, invisible from ground level, only revealed through infrared aerial imaging. The alignment was so precise, so mathematically deliberate, that the lead archaeologist on the project immediately requested the images be held from publication pending further analysis. That analysis never came. The project was quietly defunded 6 months later. The photographs were reclassified as preliminary survey data and buried in a university archive in Texas, where they remained untouched for 38 years. This is not a story about the end of the world. The Maya never predicted that. This is a story about something far stranger, far more unsettling, and far more carefully concealed by the institutions tasked with understanding our past. This is about what the Maya were actually tracking, what they were documenting with astronomical precision that exceeded any practical need for agricultural ritual, and why, in the modern era, certain discoveries about their purpose are reclassified, redirected, or simply allowed to disappear into institutional silence. The central question is simple, disturbing, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. What if the Maya were not waiting for the end of the world, but for something to return? What follows is the documentary trail of that question. A trail that begins with satellite imaging in the Cold War era, and leads to unexplained aerial phenomena reported at ancient sites in the present day. A trail marked by prestigious archaeologists who published career-making papers and then went silent. By astronomical data that was too precise to be ritual and too consistent to be coincidence. By institutional silence that speaks louder than any official statement ever could. This is the return interval. And the story begins not in ancient Mesoamerica, but in the offices of a remote sensing laboratory in Arizona in the spring of 1971. Chapter 1. A pattern. Noticed. Too late. The Landsat program changed everything, though no one realized it at first. Launched in July of 1972, Landsat 1 became the first civilian satellite designed specifically for Earth observation. It carried multispectral scanners capable of imaging the planet's surface in ways invisible to the human eye, revealing ancient riverbeds, buried roads, and structures hidden beneath jungle canopy for centuries. But before Landsat, there was the Aircraft Remote Sensing Program, a quieter initiative run jointly through NASA and several university partnerships. Between 1969 and 1973, dozens of survey flights crisscrossed Central and South America, using infrared and thermal imaging to map archaeological sites that had never been fully documented. The man who noticed the pattern was named William Harrington, a remote sensing specialist working out of the University of Arizona's Laboratory for Terrestrial Imaging. He was not an archaeologist. He was a geologist by training, hired to analyse soil composition and water retention in agricultural zones. His job was data processing, not interpretation. In the winter of 1972, Harrington was assigned to process imaging data from a series of flights over the Yucatan Peninsula and the Petén Basin in Guatemala. The flights had been commissioned by a consortium of universities studying ancient land use patterns among the Maya. Harrington's task was straightforward: clean the data, correct for atmospheric distortion, and prepare the images for the archaeologists. But Harrington was meticulous. He began overlaying the flight data with known astronomical tables, not because he suspected anything unusual, but because he wanted to test whether the imaging software could accurately detect solar alignments in ancient architecture, a known feature of Mayan construction. What he found stopped him cold. Across hundreds of kilometres, separated by dense jungle and centuries of abandonment, the major Mayan ceremonial centres aligned not just with solar events, equinoxes and solstices, but with far more complex celestial patterns. Structures at Tikal, Copan, Calakmul and Palong formed geometric relationships that corresponded to long-cycle planetary movements. Specifically, the synodic periods of Venus and Mars, and the lunar standstill cycle that repeats every 18.6 years. Harrington was not trained to interpret this. He brought the findings to his supervisor, an archaeoastronomer named Margaret Curran, who had published extensively on Mesoamerican cosmology. Curran reviewed the data over the course of a weekend and returned on Monday with a single instruction: do not share this with anyone outside the immediate team. She then contacted a colleague at the Smithsonian Institution, a Mayanist named Gerald Hawkins, who had previously worked on the astronomical alignments at Stonehenge. Hawkins flew to Arizona within the week. He spent 3 days reviewing Harrington's overlays and running independent calculations. His conclusion, delivered in a private meeting with no official record, was unambiguous. The alignments were intentional, mathematically sophisticated, and designed to track celestial events across timescales far exceeding a human lifetime. The Mayan sites were not isolated ceremonial centres. They were nodes in a network designed for observation. Hawkins recommended immediate publication. Curran disagreed. She argued that the findings would be dismissed without corroborating ground surveys and that premature release could damage the credibility of archaeoastronomy as a discipline. Hawkins reluctantly agreed to delay, on the condition that a formal research proposal be submitted within 6 months. That proposal was never submitted. In May of 1973, funding for the aircraft remote sensing program was abruptly redirected. The imaging data from Central America was transferred to the Library of Congress as part of a general archive initiative and became effectively inaccessible to researchers without prior institutional clearance. Margaret Curran retired from the University of Arizona in 1975 at the age of 48, citing health reasons. She never published another paper. William Harrington left the remote sensing lab later that same year and took a position with a private mineral survey company in Nevada. He gave one interview in 1997 to a graduate student researching the history of archaeological remote sensing, in which he stated, quote, "We saw something that didn't fit the narrative. That's usually where the funding stops." Gerald Hawkins continued his work on ancient astronomy and published extensively on Stonehenge, Egyptian pyramids, and other megalithic sites. He never mentioned the Mayan alignment data again. When asked in an interview shortly before his death in 2003 whether he believed ancient civilizations possessed advanced astronomical knowledge, he replied, "I believe they were documenting something. Whether they understood it is another question." The imaging data from 1972 remained archived and largely forgotten until 2010, when a doctoral candidate in remote sensing at MIT requested access as part of a dissertation on early satellite archaeology. The request was approved, but the specific files Harrington had worked on were listed as damaged and unrecoverable. No backup copies were ever located. Chapter 2: Chichen Itza and the Serpent That Points Up. Every year, tens of thousands of tourists gather at Chichen Itza on the spring and autumn equinoxes to witness the descent of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent god whose shadow appears to slither down the northern staircase of the pyramid known as El Castillo. It is one of the most celebrated examples of Mayan astronomical precision. As the sun sets, the angle of light creates a series of triangular shadows along the pyramid's edge, forming the body of a serpent that connects to the carved stone head at the base. The effect lasts approximately 34 minutes. Tourists photograph it. Guides explain it. archaeologists cite it as evidence of the Mayas' sophisticated understanding of solar cycles. What is almost never mentioned is what happens after the serpent reaches the ground. In the final 6 minutes of the phenomenon, as the sunlight fades and the serpent's shadow dissolves, a secondary alignment occurs. The head of the stone serpent at the pyramid's base does not face the plaza, as most assume. It is angled 11 degrees east of true north. This positioning aligns the serpent's gaze with a specific point on the horizon, a point that, on the equinox, corresponds precisely to the rising position of the star cluster known as the Pleiades. This alignment was first documented in 1976 by an archaeoastronomer named Anthony Aveni, working with a team from Colgate University. Aveni's published paper noted the Pleiades connection, but described it as symbolic, part of the broader Mayan association between the Pleiades and agricultural cycles. But Aveni's field notes, which were donated to the Colgate University archives after his retirement, tell a more uncertain story. In handwritten annotations dated October 1976, Aveni noted that the alignment was too precise for symbolic function, and questioned why the pyramid's architecture would encode a secondary celestial target that was invisible during the primary shadow event. He also noted something else. The Pleiades alignment only occurs on the equinox during a narrow historical window. Due to the precession of the Earth's axis, the rising point of the Pleiades shifts slowly over centuries. Aveni calculated that the pyramid's Pleiades alignment would have been exact during the late Classic Maya period, roughly between 600 and 900 of the Common Era. This suggested the pyramid was not built for general equinox observation. It was built for a specific astronomical moment, one that had already passed by the time the structure was completed. Or, as Aveni wrote in his notes, the alignment commemorates an event, not a cycle. Aveni never expanded on this observation in his published work. When asked in interviews about the Pleiades connection, he typically referred to it as an interesting detail, but not central to understanding Chichen Itza's purpose. In a 1998 interview for a documentary on ancient astronomy, he described the serpent phenomenon as a demonstration of solar knowledge and made no reference to stellar alignments, but others noticed. In 1983, a researcher named Linda Shealy, one of the foremost epigraphers of Mayan hieroglyphic writing, published a paper analysing inscriptions at Chichen Itza and other sites that referenced the Pleiades. Shealy's work revealed that the Maya referred to the Pleiades as the handful of stars and associated them with creation mythology, specifically the moment when the gods arranged the cosmos and set time in motion. Shealy noted that at multiple sites, the Pleiades were referenced not as agricultural markers, but as witnesses. The glyphs described them as watchers, or those who see from above. She concluded that the Pleiades held cosmological significance beyond agriculture, possibly representing divine observation or cosmic order. What Shealy did not publish, but mentioned in a lecture at the University of Texas in 1985, was that several inscriptions appear to describe the Pleiades not as fixed stars, but as something that moved. The glyphs referenced a return passage and a time of crossing, terms that did not align with the star's fixed position in the sky. Shealy's lecture was recorded, but the tape was never transcribed or archived. A partial transcript survives in the notes of a graduate student who attended. In it, Shealy is quoted as saying, "If I didn't know better, I would say these texts describe the Pleiades as a rendezvous point. Not a location in our sky, but a location something else used." She did not elaborate. The lecture series concluded shortly after, and Shealy returned to her work on Mayan kingship and political history. She died in 1998, widely regarded as one of the most important Mayanists of the 20th century. Her personal research files, including unpublished notes on the Pleiades inscriptions, were donated to the Mesoamerican Archive at the University of Texas. They remain accessible to researchers by appointment. However, according to the archive's access logs, the Pleiades files have been requested only twice since 2000, both times by researchers whose work was never published. At Chichen Itza, the equinox event continues. Guides explain the serpent's descent. Tourists take photographs, and every year, for 6 minutes after the shadow fades, the stone serpent's head points toward the Pleiades, toward the handful of stars the Maya called the Watchers. No one mentions it, but the alignment remains as precise as the day it was carved. Chapter 3. Venus. Data that doesn't fit ritual use. The Dresden Codex is one of only 4 surviving Mayan books, the rest having been destroyed during the Spanish conquest. It is held in the Saxon State and University Library in Dresden, Germany, where it has been since the 18th century. It is also one of the most studied documents in Mesoamerican archaeology, and it should not exist. Not because it is fragile or ancient, though it is both, but because the information it contains is far too precise for its supposed purpose. The Codex is most famous for its Venus tables, a series of pages that track the synodic cycle of Venus with extraordinary accuracy. The synodic period of Venus, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun, is approximately 584 days. The Dresden Codex records this cycle across multiple pages, accounting for cumulative drift and providing correction factors that allow the tables to remain accurate over centuries. This level of precision is not unusual in itself. Many ancient civilizations tracked Venus. The Babylonians did, the Egyptians did, the Greeks did. What makes the Dresden Codex unusual is the scale of the tracking and the corrections embedded within it. The Venus tables in the Codex do not just track individual cycles, they track the long-term relationship between Venus, Earth, and the Mayan calendar system across a span of several centuries. The tables account for irregularities in Venus's orbit, tiny variations caused by gravitational interactions with other planets, and include correction intervals to realign the calendar with observed reality. In other words, the tables were designed to remain accurate far longer than a single human lifetime, far longer than would be necessary for ritual or agricultural purposes. This was first recognised in the early 20th century by Ernst Fürstemann, a German librarian and scholar who spent decades studying the Codex. Fürstemann noted that the Venus tables included predictive corrections that would only become necessary after prolonged observation spanning not years, but centuries. His conclusion, published in 1906, was straightforward. The Maya had maintained continuous astronomical records across generations, passing down cumulative data with institutional precision. He compared it to the monastic record-keeping of medieval Europe, or the astronomical archives of Babylon. But Fürstemann also noted something else, something he described as peculiar in his annotations. The corrections in the Venus tables were not evenly distributed. They clustered around specific intervals that did not correspond to any known ritual calendar or agricultural cycle. The intervals appeared to mark windows, periods of heightened observation. Fürstemann did not pursue this observation. He died in 1906, the same year his analysis was published. His notes on the peculiar intervals were mentioned briefly in later commentaries, but never systematically studied. It was not until the 1970s that the intervals were examined in detail. The work was done by Floyd Lounsbury, a linguist and epigrapher at Yale University, who had spent years deciphering Mayan mathematics and calendrical systems. Lounsbury applied modern astronomical software to the Venus tables, cross-referencing the correction intervals with actual planetary data. What he found was unsettling. The correction intervals in the Dresden Codex aligned with rare astronomical events, not regular cycles but uncommon configurations. Specifically, they marked moments when Venus, Earth and Mars reach particular geometric relationships in their orbits, events that occur only once every several decades. Lounsbury published his findings in a technical paper in 1978, in which he concluded that the Dresden Codex was not simply a ritual calendar. It was an observational log designed to track recurring but irregular celestial events over timescales that exceeded practical necessity. He stopped short of speculating why such tracking would be necessary. But in a letter to a colleague, later archived at Yale, Lounsbury wrote, "The level of effort required to maintain these tables suggests expectation. They were not tracking Venus for agriculture, they were waiting for something." Lounsbury's work was well received in academic circles but did not generate widespread attention. The Venus tables were acknowledged as sophisticated, but the broader implications were not pursued. Lounsbury himself moved on to other aspects of Mayan epigraphy and mathematics, publishing extensively until his death in 2008. However, in the 1990s, another researcher revisited the Dresden Codex with a different question. Her name was Victoria Bricker, an anthropologist at Tulane University. Bricker's focus was not on the mathematics, but on the accompanying glyphs, the written annotations that appeared alongside the Venus tables. Bricker's analysis revealed that the glyphs did not describe rituals or ceremonies, they described observations. The language was technical, procedural. The glyphs recorded what was seen, when it was seen, and whether it matched prior expectations. Bricker noted that the tone of the inscriptions was unusual for Mayan writing. Most Mayan texts are richly symbolic, invoking gods, kings, and mythological events. The Venus annotations in the Dresden Codex were different. They were sparse, factual, almost bureaucratic. In a 1996 paper, Bricker described the Venus tables as an institutional record maintained across generations for purposes that remain unclear. She noted that the language suggested the Maya were not worshipping Venus, but monitoring it. Bricker's paper was published in a specialised journal and received little attention outside academic circles. She continued her work on Mayan calendrics and ethnography, retiring from Tulane in 2015. The Dresden Codex remains in Dresden, where it is displayed under controlled atmospheric conditions to prevent further deterioration. Researchers can request high-resolution images for study. The Venus tables have been digitized and are accessible through several academic databases, but the question Lounsbury raised in his private letter has never been formally addressed. If the Maya were waiting for something, the tables do not say what. They only record the when, and the when, according to the corrections embedded in the Codex, has not yet passed. Chapter 4. The Modern Astronomer. His name was David Kelly, and he did not set out to upend Mayan scholarship. He was an astronomer first, an archaeologist only by proximity. His background was in positional astronomy and celestial mechanics, fields concerned with the movements of stars and planets, not the interpretation of ancient ruins. Kelly came to Mayan studies almost by accident. In the early 1980s, he was teaching at the University of Calgary, running a small research group focused on historical astronomy, the study of how ancient cultures observed and recorded the sky. He had worked on Babylonian eclipse records, Egyptian star charts, and Chinese dynastic astronomy. Mesoamerica was not his focus. That changed in 1983, when a colleague handed him a copy of the Dresden Codex Venus tables and asked if he could verify the mathematical accuracy. Kelly ran the numbers, confirmed the precision, and then, out of professional curiosity, began mapping the tables against actual planetary positions over the past 3,000 years. What he noticed was a timing problem. The Venus tables in the Dresden Codex were not designed to track Venus in general. They were optimized for a specific observational context, one in which Venus, Mars and Earth reached recurring alignment windows that allowed for maximum visibility and predictability. These windows did not occur annually. They occurred in clusters, separated by gaps of decades. Kelly calculated that the most recent cluster of optimal observation windows had occurred between 1962 and 1974. The next cluster would not occur until 2031. This was odd. If the Venus tables were ritual, why optimize them for rare windows? If they were agricultural, the intervals made no sense. Agricultural cycles depend on the sun and moon, not on multiplanetary alignments. Kelly began examining other Mayan astronomical records, codices, stele inscriptions, architectural alignments. He found the same pattern. The Mayan astronomical system was not organised around annual cycles. It was organised around intervals, long intervals, tracked with institutional precision, pointing toward events that recurred only rarely. In 1986, Kelly published a paper titled Mayan Astronomy as Predictive Observation. In it, he argued that the Maya were not worshipping celestial bodies or using them to mark seasons. They were tracking return events. His conclusion was careful, but clear. The Mayan astronomical records resembled the work of a culture expecting something to recur on a known but infrequent schedule. The paper was published in the Journal for the History of Astronomy, a respected but specialised publication. It received polite academic attention. Some scholars found it intriguing, others dismissed it as over-interpretation. Kelly was invited to present at a few conferences, where his work was received with interest but not enthusiasm. Then, in 1988, something changed. Kelly was contacted by a researcher from the United States Geological Survey, a geologist named Thomas Seaver, who had been working with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory on the application of remote sensing to archaeology. Seaver had been mapping Mayan sites using thermal imaging and had noticed something unusual. Several major ceremonial centres, when viewed from orbit, formed geometric patterns that aligned not with each other, but with specific points in the sky. Seaver asked Kelly if he could identify what those points were. Kelly spent 6 months analysing the data. The points were not stars, they were coordinates, locations in the sky where certain planetary alignments became visible from Central America during the observation windows Kelly had identified. The Mayan sites were not randomly positioned. They were placed to optimize sight lines towards specific celestial events. Kelly and Seaver co-authored a paper, but it was never published. According to Seaver, the draft was submitted to the journal Science in 1989 and rejected on the grounds that the conclusions were speculative and unsupported by corroborating ground surveys. Seaver resubmitted to a smaller journal. That submission was also rejected. In a 1997 interview, Seaver said, "We were told the work was interesting but not relevant to current archaeological priorities. I got the sense that people didn't want to go down that road." Kelly, meanwhile, continued his research independently. He stopped submitting to journals and instead began compiling a comprehensive database of Mayan astronomical alignments, cross-referenced with planetary positions over a span of 5,000 years. He worked on this project for the next decade, largely in isolation. In 2004, Kelly gave a lecture at the University of Calgary in which he presented his findings. He argued that the Mayan civilization had constructed an observation network, a distributed system of sites designed to track long-interval celestial events, with precision exceeding any practical need. He concluded by stating that the Maya appeared to have been documenting something, and that their records indicated that whatever they were documenting had not stopped. The lecture was attended by approximately 30 people, mostly graduate students and faculty from the astronomy and anthropology departments. It was not recorded. No transcript exists. The only evidence of the lecture is a brief mention in the university's event archives and a set of handwritten notes taken by a graduate student, later donated to the university library. Kelly retired from the University of Calgary in 2006. He moved to British Columbia, where he continued his research privately. He published no further academic papers. In 2012, following the widespread media attention surrounding the so-called Mayan calendar apocalypse, Kelly gave a single interview to a Canadian science magazine. In it, he was asked whether the Maya had predicted the end of the world. His response was blunt. The Maya never predicted an end. They predicted a reset, a return to the beginning of a new cycle. People misunderstood that as apocalypse. It was never about ending. It was about expectation. When asked what the Maya were expecting, Kelly declined to speculate. He died in 2018 at the age of 84. His personal research files were donated to the University of Calgary archives, where they remain accessible to researchers by appointment. The database he compiled, cross-referencing Mayan sites with planetary alignments, has never been published. Chapter 5. The Shift After Space Exploration. By the late 1990s, humanity had sent probes to every planet in the solar system. We had mapped the surface of Venus, landed rovers on Mars, and flown past the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. The solar system was no longer a mystery. It was a surveyed territory, hostile and lifeless. This had consequences for the study of ancient astronomy, and for the conspiracy theories built around it. For decades, speculative theorists had pointed to the Mayan obsession with Venus as evidence of extraterrestrial contact. The reasoning was straightforward. Why would a pre-industrial civilization track Venus with such precision unless they had a reason to believe something was there? The theory suggested that Venus had once been habitable, or that it served as a waypoint for visitors from elsewhere in the galaxy, or that the Maya had received direct knowledge from beings who travelled from Venus to Earth. These theories were widespread in popular literature from the 1960s through the 1980s. Books like Chariots of the Gods and The Serious Mystery built entire frameworks around the idea that ancient civilizations had been visited, taught, or even colonized by extraterrestrial intelligences who came from, or through, our neighbouring planets. But the Magellan mission to Venus, which mapped the planet's surface between 1990 and 1994, made those theories untenable. Venus was revealed as a hellscape, surface temperatures hot enough to melt lead, atmospheric pressure 90 times that of Earth, and clouds of sulfuric acid. There was no water, no breathable atmosphere, no possibility of life as we understand it, not now and not in any recent geological past. The images from Magellan were widely published. For anyone paying attention, the message was clear. Venus was not, and had never been, a place anyone could visit. The popular extraterrestrial theories collapsed, or rather, they evolved. By the late 1990s, a new interpretation began to circulate in fringe academic and online communities. The argument was this: Venus itself was not the destination. It was a marker, a reference point. The Maya were not tracking Venus because anything was there, but because Venus was being used by something else as a navigational coordinate. This theory required a conceptual shift. Instead of asking why the Maya cared about Venus, the question became, what were the Maya helping someone else track? The theory proposed that the Venus tables in the Dresden Codex were not religious texts or agricultural tools, but coordination schedules. The precise intervals, the corrections for long-term drift, the clustering of observations around rare planetary alignments. All of this made sense if the Maya were maintaining a schedule on behalf of something that needed to know when certain celestial conditions would repeat. This idea was not taken seriously in academic circles. It was published in self-published books, discussed on early internet forums, and referenced in fringe documentaries. It had no institutional support, no peer review, no credible evidence. But it had one uncomfortable feature. It fit the data better than the ritual explanation. If the Maya were tracking Venus for agricultural reasons, the precision was absurd. If they were tracking it for religious reasons, the institutional continuity across centuries made little sense. Religious practices change, priesthoods rise and fall, dynasties collapse. Yet the Venus tables in the Dresden Codex show no interruption, no deviation. The observations continued, generation after generation, with mechanical consistency. That kind of consistency suggests obligation, or instruction. The theory gained traction not because it was proven, but because the alternative explanations had grown thin. Archaeologists continued to describe Mayan astronomy as ritual, but the ritual, explanations were increasingly strained. Why maintain corrections for centuries if the goal was symbolic? Why encode architectural alignments that only worked during rare multiplanetary configurations? In 2002, a researcher named John Carlson, director of the Center for Archaeastronomy, published a paper in which he argued that Mayan astronomy was best understood as practical observation for non-practical purposes. He acknowledged that the precision exceeded any known function, but concluded that this was simply a reflection of Mayan intellectual achievement. It was a respectful answer. It was also, by Carlson's own admission, incomplete. In a 2009 interview, Carlson was asked why the Maya would dedicate such enormous resources to tracking planets with no apparent benefit. His answer was measured. We assume there was no benefit because we don't know what the benefit was. That doesn't mean there wasn't one. By the 2010s, the extraterrestrial interpretation had shifted again. Venus was no longer seen as the origin point. It was seen as the clock. The Maya were not contacted by beings from Venus. They were taught to watch Venus because Venus, in its predictable orbital relationship with Earth and Mars, created windows, moments when something could move through the solar system with minimal gravitational interference. This version of the theory did not require believing Venus was habitable. It only required believing that someone at some point had taught the Maya to track the schedule, and that whoever had taught them expected to return. Chapter 6. The Year. Everyone misunderstood. December 21st, 2012 came and went. The world did not end. The sun rose. The Maya long count calendar completed its 13th Baktun, a cycle of approximately 5,125 years, and rolled over into the 14th. Media outlets that had spent months speculating about apocalypse quietly moved on. The story became a punchline. Mayan scholars, who had spent years explaining that the Maya never predicted an end, were largely ignored. But among those who had been paying close attention to Mayan astronomy, the date was not a disappointment. It was a confirmation. The completion of the 13th Baktun was not an ending. It was a marker, a reset point in the cyclical calendar system. The Maya never described it as catastrophic. The inscriptions that reference the date describe it as a moment of renewal, a return to the beginning of the count. The misunderstanding was not accidental. It was rooted in a fundamental misreading of how the Maya understood time. Western linear time moves in one direction, past to present to future. Events happen once. History does not repeat. The Maya did not think this way. Mayan time was cyclical, layered, and recursive. Events recurred, patterns repeated. The calendar was not a countdown to an endpoint. It was a system for tracking when cycles aligned, when conditions returned, when the same celestial geometry repeated. The long count calendar was one layer of this system. The Zolkin and Harb calendars were others. Together, they formed a complex interlocking mechanism that allowed the Maya to track time across multiple scales: daily, yearly, generational, and cosmological. The 13th Baktun marked the completion of one grand cycle and the beginning of another. From a Mayan perspective, this was not an end. It was a moment of alignment, a return to starting conditions. And if you were tracking something that moved according to long cycles, a reset point would be critical. It would mark the beginning of a new observation window. This interpretation was not widely discussed in 2012, but it was noted by a few researchers who had studied Mayan astronomy in depth. One of them was a scholar named Gerardo Aldana, a professor of Chicana and Chicano studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, with a focus on Mayan mathematics and astronomy. In a paper published in 2014, Aldana argued that the 2012 date had been misunderstood not just by the public, but by scholars. The inscriptions describing the Baktun transition did not describe an apocalypse. They described an expectation, a return. Aldana noted that several Mayan texts, including inscriptions at the site of Tortuguero, referenced the completion of the 13th Baktun as a moment when the god will descend, or the witness will return. These phrases had been interpreted as mythological, references to divine kingship or cosmological symbolism. But Aldana pointed out that the language was not metaphorical, it was procedural. The texts described specific actions: descending, witnessing, appearing. The grammar suggested literal occurrence, not symbolic ritual. Aldana's paper was titled The Return Clause, Reconsidering Mayan Baktun. Inscriptions as Astronomical Expectation. It was published in a specialized journal and received limited attention outside Mayan studies. But the timing was notable. The paper was published 2 years after the supposed apocalypse, at a moment when mainstream interest in Mayan calendars had evaporated. Aldana's argument, that the Maya were not predicting an end but marking the beginning of a new cycle of observation, went largely unnoticed. Aldana continued his research, and in 2018 published a book examining Mayan astronomy and mathematics. In it he argued that the Mayan calendar system was not purely symbolic, it was functional. It was designed to track rare events, predict their recurrence, and ensure that knowledge was preserved across generations. He also noted something else. The Mayan system included future dates. Inscriptions at several sites referenced events that would occur thousands of years beyond the completion of the 13th Baktun. These dates were not symbolic. They were calculated with the same precision as historical records. The Maya were not just documenting the past, they were scheduling the future. Aldana did not speculate on what those future dates represented, but he concluded his book with a single observation. A civilization that constructs a calendar extending thousands of years into the future is not simply marking time, it is maintaining a schedule. For whom, we do not yet know. The book was well reviewed in academic circles but did not generate widespread attention. Aldana remains at UC Santa Barbara, where he continues to study Mayan mathematics and epigraphy. The date in 2012 passed. The new Baktun began, and the Mayan calendar, still intact in inscriptions across Central America, continues to count forward toward dates that have not yet arrived. Chapter 7. Modern Sightings Near Ancient Sites. The reports began quietly, scattered across forums and local news outlets in southern Mexico, Guatemala and Belize. They were not dramatic, no crashes, no abductions. Nothing that fit the classic UFO narrative, just lights, silent, brief, and always near ancient Mayan ruins. The first documented case appeared in 2003, reported by a night security guard at the archaeological site of Calakmul, a remote Mayan city deep in the jungle of Campeche, Mexico. The guard, whose name was withheld in the initial report, described seeing a series of lights hovering above the main pyramid complex for approximately 8 minutes. The lights were white, unblinking, and moved in slow, coordinated patterns before vanishing without sound. The incident was reported to local authorities, who noted it in a routine log but conducted no investigation. The guard was reassigned shortly afterward. Similar reports appeared sporadically over the next decade. In 2006, a group of archaeologists working at the site of Copan in Honduras reported seeing lights moving across the central plaza at night. The lights were observed for roughly 10 minutes before disappearing. The archaeologists reported the incident to the Honduran Institute of Anthropology and History, which acknowledged the report but took no further action. In 2011, a tourist visiting Tikal in Guatemala captured a brief video on a handheld camera showing a light moving above the Temple of the Jaguar. The video, uploaded to YouTube, showed a white point of light moving in a smooth arc across the night sky before abruptly stopping and fading. The video received moderate attention online but was largely dismissed as a drone, satellite, or camera artifact. In 2014, a more detailed report emerged from Palenque, one of the most extensively studied Mayan sites in Mexico. A team of Mexican astronomers had set up equipment at the site to observe a meteor shower. Over the course of 2 nights, they observed and recorded 3 separate instances of unidentified lights appearing above the Temple of Inscriptions. The lights moved slowly, hovered, and then departed vertically at speeds inconsistent with known aircraft. The astronomers filed a formal report with the Mexican Space Agency, which reviewed the data and classified it as unexplained aerial phenomena. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The astronomers were discouraged from publicising their findings and did not publish the data. By 2016, a pattern had become clear to those tracking the reports. The sightings were not random. They occurred almost exclusively at major Mayan ceremonial sites. They occurred at night. They occurred most frequently during periods when Venus, Mars, or both were prominent in the night sky. And they occurred most frequently around dates that corresponded to the correction intervals in the Dresden Codex. This connection was first noted by an independent researcher named Alan Green, a retired aerospace engineer who had become interested in Mayan astronomy. After visiting Chichen Itza in 2010, Green began compiling reports of aerial anomalies near Mayan sites, cross-referencing them with planetary positions and calendar dates. In 2017, Green published his findings on a personal website. He noted that of the 37 documented sightings he had compiled, 31 occurred within a week of dates that corresponded to Venus table correction intervals. The probability of this being coincidence, according to Green's analysis, was less than 2%. Green's work was not peer-reviewed and received little attention in academic circles, but it was circulated widely in online communities interested in unexplained phenomena. Green gave several interviews on podcasts and fringe media outlets, in which he argued that the sightings were not random UFO events, but scheduled observations, something returning at intervals predicted by the Mayan calendar system. In 2019, Green attempted to predict the next sighting based on the Dresden Codex correction, intervals. He calculated that the next window would occur in late September, during a period when Venus and Mars would reach a specific alignment visible from Central America. Green travelled to the site of Uxmal in the Yucatan and spent 4 nights observing the sky with camera equipment. On the 3rd night, he recorded a light moving above the Pyramid of the Magician. The light appeared at approximately 11:47 in the evening, moved in a slow arc across the site, and disappeared after 6 minutes. Green uploaded the footage to his website. The video showed a point of light, steady and white, moving at a consistent speed before fading. The footage was analysed by several independent researchers who confirmed that the light did not match the movement profile of satellites, aircraft or drones. No official explanation was provided. Green continued his work until his death in 2022. His website remains online, maintained by a colleague, and contains the most comprehensive public archive of sighting reports near Mayan sites. The reports have not stopped. In 2023, guards at the site of Caracol in Belize reported seeing lights on 3 separate occasions, all during periods of Mars prominence. In 2024, a research team at Yachilan in Mexico observed a light hovering above the site for 12 minutes before departing. None of these incidents have been investigated by government agencies, none have been explained, and all of them occurred near sites where the Maya once tracked the sky with instruments we still do not fully understand. The lights are brief, silent, and they continue to appear, just as the calendar said they would. Chapter 8. The Suppressed Interpretation. The academic community has rules, not written but understood. There are topics you can study and topics you cannot, or rather, topics you can study, but only if you frame them correctly. Straying from acceptable framing does not result in immediate censure. It results in something quieter, withdrawn funding, rejected publications, the slow erosion of institutional support. Extraterrestrial interpretations of ancient civilizations fall firmly into the forbidden category, not because the possibility is considered impossible, but because the topic has been poisoned by decades of pseudoscientific speculation. Serious researchers avoid it, not out of intellectual dishonesty, but out of professional survival. But there have been exceptions, researchers who, intentionally or not, touched the question and then disappeared from public discourse. One was a Belgian archaeologist named Henri Neuville, who worked extensively on Mayan epigraphy in the 1970s and 80s. Neuville was a respected scholar, published frequently, and was considered a leading expert on Mayan inscriptions related to cosmology and creation mythology. In 1989, Neuville was invited to present at a conference in Mexico City on Mesoamerican astronomy. His presentation, titled The Mayan Record as Institutional Continuity, argued that the Mayan astronomical system was not developed independently within Mayan civilization, but appeared suddenly, fully formed, with no developmental precursor. Neuville pointed out that other ancient astronomical systems, Babylonian, Egyptian, Chinese, showed clear developmental arcs. Early records were crude, improving over centuries as techniques refined and knowledge accumulated. The Mayan system showed no such progression. The earliest astronomical records were already sophisticated, already precise, already accounting for long-term cycles and corrections. Neuville's conclusion was carefully worded. The Mayan astronomical system suggested transmission of knowledge rather than independent discovery. He did not speculate on the source. The presentation was not well received. Neuville was accused of promoting diffusionist theories, of undermining indigenous, intellectual achievement, of making claims unsupported by evidence. He was not invited to present at future conferences. His subsequent papers were rejected by major journals. Neuville published one final paper in 1992. a technical analysis of Mayan eclipse records, which made no reference to his earlier work. He retired from the University of Brussels in 1994 and published nothing further. A similar trajectory occurred with an American archaeoastronomer named Marian Hatch, who worked on Mayan sites in Guatemala during the 1990s. Hatch's research focused on the alignment of ceremonial architecture with celestial events, and she published several well-regarded papers on the subject. In 2001, Hatch gave a lecture at a small academic conference, in which she discussed what she called observational redundancy at Mayan sites. She noted that many structures were aligned to track the same celestial events, even when separated by hundreds of kilometres. This redundancy, Hatch argued, suggested the sites were part of a coordinated network rather than independent ceremonial centres. Hatch went further. She suggested that the redundancy implied external instruction, that the Maya were not designing these alignments independently, but were following a template provided from elsewhere. She did not say where elsewhere was, but the implication was clear. Hatch's lecture was not recorded, but a summary appeared in the conference proceedings. Her next grant application, submitted 6 months later, was rejected. She applied twice more over the following year. Both rejections cited lack of novelty and speculative conclusions. Hatch left academia in 2004 and now works as a consultant for cultural heritage preservation. She has not published research on Mayan astronomy since. There are others. A German researcher named Klaus Richter, who published a paper in 2007 arguing that the Dresden Codex showed signs of external editorial consistency, suggesting it had been maintained according to guidelines that did not originate within Mayan culture. Richter's paper was published in a minor journal and received no citations. He moved to private research shortly afterward. A Mexican archaeologist named Sofia Paredes, who noted in a 2013 paper that certain Mayan inscriptions used technical language that appeared borrowed rather than native, as though describing concepts introduced from outside Mayan linguistic tradition. Paredes' paper was criticised for overinterpretation, and she shifted her research focus to pottery. The pattern is consistent. Researchers who suggest the Mayan astronomical system was influenced, instructed, or coordinated from an external source face professional consequences. Not dramatic, not immediate, but effective. The acceptable narrative is this: the Maya developed their astronomical knowledge independently over centuries through careful observation and intellectual brilliance. This narrative is respectful, empowering, and probably true in most respects. But it does not explain the sudden appearance of a fully realised system. It does not explain the institutional continuity across centuries. It does not explain the precision that exceeded necessity, and it does not explain why the corrections in the Dresden Codex were designed to remain accurate far into the future, a future the Maya would never see. The researchers who pointed this out were not wrong, they were simply unwelcome, and so the interpretation that fits the data, that the Maya were maintaining something on behalf of something else, remains unspoken in academic circles, not because it has been disproven, because it cannot be said. Chapter 9. The Star Gods Reframed. In Mayan cosmology, the gods were not rulers, they were witnesses. This distinction is critical, and it has been lost in most popular retellings. The Popol Vuh, the Mayan creation text, preserved by the Quiche people of highland Guatemala, describes the gods as entities who observe, who test, who measure. They do not command, they do not conquer, they watch, and they judge whether creation has unfolded correctly. The creation of humanity, according to the Popol Vuh, was not an act of love or divine will. It was a process of refinement. The gods created beings from mud. Those failed. They created beings from wood. Those were destroyed. Finally, they created beings from maize, who could speak, think, and remember. These beings were acceptable. They could observe the sky and recount what they saw. This is the key. The purpose of humanity, in Mayan cosmology, was observation. To see. To remember. To record. The gods did not want worshippers. They wanted witnesses. This framework, largely overlooked in popular interpretations, completely changes how we understand the relationship between the Maya and their so-called deities. The gods were not beings to be pleased or appeased. They were something else. Observers who returned at intervals to check the records, to see if the count had been maintained. The temples were not places of worship. They were marker sites, observatories, not to watch the gods, but to watch on behalf of the gods. This reinterpretation emerged quietly in the work of several Mayan epigraphers in the 2000s, most notably in the writings of a scholar named Michael Coe, a professor emeritus at Yale and one of the most influential Mayanists of the 20th century. In his later works, Coe noted that the relationship between the Maya and their gods was transactional rather than devotional. He wrote in a 2005 edition of his book The Maya, "The gods were not loved, they were acknowledged. The rituals were not offerings of devotion, but confirmations of duty. The Maya maintained the calendar not because they feared the gods, but because they had agreed to." Coe did not elaborate on what agreed to meant, and he did not speculate on the origin of the agreement. But his phrasing was deliberate. The Maya had a contract, an obligation. They fulfilled it across centuries, even as their cities fell, even as their civilization fragmented. This interpretation aligns with the physical evidence. The astronomical records show no interruption. The Venus tables in the Dresden Codex continue to be maintained even during periods of political collapse and widespread abandonment of urban centres. Whoever was keeping the records, they did not stop when the cities emptied. That kind of continuity suggests something deeper than religion. Religion fades when institutions collapse. Obligations do not if someone is still expecting the work to be done. The question then becomes, who were the gods? The popular extraterrestrial interpretation suggests they were visitors from another world, beings who came to Earth, instructed the Maya, and left. This interpretation is dramatic, cinematic, and almost certainly wrong. The evidence does not support visitation. It supports monitoring. If the Maya were in direct contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, we would expect to see material evidence, technology, impossible architecture, physical artifacts that defy explanation. We do not see that. The Mayan cities are impressive, but they are not impossible. The astronomical records are sophisticated, but they are not beyond human capability, if that capability is directed, instructed, and sustained. What we see instead is the behaviour of a culture that has been taught to watch and report. The temples are observation platforms, the codices are logs, the calendar is a schedule. The star gods, in this framework, are not invaders or saviours, they are field researchers, and the Maya were their research assistants, maintaining continuity, recording data, ensuring that observations were made when the schedule required it. This interpretation is not comforting. It does not cast humanity as chosen or special. It casts us as participants in something we do not control and may not fully understand. But it fits. It explains the precision without requiring impossible technology. It explains the institutional continuity without requiring religious fervour. And it explains the future dates in the calendar, because the observers are not finished. They are still checking in. The Maya documented them, not as gods to be worshipped, but as entities to be acknowledged, entities who return, entities who expect the records to be kept, and the records are still being kept, by archaeologists who excavate the ruins, by astronomers who study the alignments, by researchers who decode the codices. We are still doing the work the Maya began. We just no longer know why. Chapter 10. Why contact was never the goal. The central assumption of most extraterrestrial contact theories is that contact would be dramatic, intentional, and interactive. Ships would land, messages would be sent, communication would occur. This is the framework of science fiction, and it has shaped how we imagine first contact. But that assumption may be wrong. If an intelligence wanted to study Earth over long timescales, centuries, millennia, direct contact would be counterproductive. Contact introduces variables. It changes the system being observed. Any intervention, no matter how subtle, alters the natural development of the observed culture. A better method would be passive observation, conducted at intervals, With minimal interference, you would not land, you would not communicate, you would simply observe, record, and return. And if you needed observations made during periods when you were not present, you would teach a local population to make those observations for you. You would give them just enough knowledge to maintain the records, astronomy, mathematics, calendrical systems, and then you would leave, knowing they would continue the work in your absence. This is not speculation. This is how long-term ecological and anthropological studies are conducted on Earth. Researchers do not remain in the field continuously. They establish monitoring stations, train local assistants, and return at intervals to collect data. The system runs itself. The observers need only to check in. The Mayan civilization, viewed through this framework, begins to look less like a culture contacted by extraterrestrials and more like a culture that was part of a long-term monitoring program. The astronomical records are too precise for ritual. The continuity is too consistent for religion. The future dates are too distant for practical use. But all of it makes sense if the Maya were maintaining observational data on behalf of something that expected to return. The question is, what were they observing? The obvious answer is themselves, or rather, us, humanity. The Maya were not tracking planets for the sake of astronomy. They were tracking conditions, planetary alignments, celestial windows that allowed for optimal observation of Earth from a distance. If you wanted to observe a planet without being detected, you would not orbit continuously. You would observe during windows when gravitational interference from other bodies was minimized, when certain planetary alignments provided optimal sightlines, when your presence would be brief and easily dismissed. You would schedule your observations, and you would teach the local population to track the schedule, so that even if they did not understand why, they would know when you would return. The Dresden Codex, in this interpretation, is not a religious text. It is a field manual, a schedule of observation windows maintained across generations, ensuring continuity even when the original observers are long gone. The Maya fulfilled their role. They kept the schedule, they maintained the records, and when their cities collapsed, when their population dispersed, the knowledge did not die. It was preserved in codices, in inscriptions, in the alignments of ruined temples. It was preserved because someone expected to come back and check. This is why contact was never the goal. The observers were not interested in changing us, teaching us, or communicating with us. They were interested in watching us, across centuries, across the rise and fall of civilizations, tracking long-term patterns that only become visible over timescales, far exceeding a human lifetime. The Maya are gone, but the system remains. The temples still align with the stars. The codices still predict planetary positions centuries into the future. The calendar still counts forward, marking dates that have not yet arrived, and the sightings continue, brief, silent, near the ancient sites, always during the windows the calendar predicted. We are still being watched. We have always been watched. The Maya knew this. They wrote it down. They built monuments to mark it, and then they disappeared, leaving behind the schedule. The observers do not need to announce themselves. They need only to return, check the data, and leave. They have been doing this for millennia, and if the calendar is correct, they are not finished. The next major alignment window occurs in 2031. The Dresden Codex marks it as a correction interval, a reset, a moment when the cycle repeats and observation resumes. We do not know what will be observed. We do not know who is observing, but we know, with uncomfortable precision, when they will return, because the Maya told us, and we have spent centuries trying not to believe them. Epilogue. The sky. The Maya never stopped watching. Every day, thousands of tourists visit the ruins at Chichen Itza, Tikal, Palenque, and Copan. They photograph the pyramids, walk the plazas, listen to guides explain the astronomical sophistication of the Maya. They are told about the calendar, the Venus tables, the equinox alignments. They are told the Maya were brilliant astronomers, visionary mathematicians, master architects. All of this is true, but it is not the whole truth. At night, after the tourists leave, the sites fall silent, the lights dim, The stone structures stand alone under the same sky the Maya once watched with such obsessive, institutional precision. And sometimes in the darkness lights appear. They move slowly, they hover, they watch. No one mentions this during the day. It is not part of the tour, it is not in the guidebooks. But the guards know, the researchers know. The people who spend enough time at these sites, who stay through the night, who watch the sky the way the Maya once did, they know. Something is still watching, just as it always has, just as the calendar said it would. The Maya did not build their temples to reach the gods. They built them so the gods could find them, so that when the observers returned, the markers would still be there, pointing to the same stars, the same planets, the same celestial coordinates. The Maya are gone, but the markers remain, and the schedule continues. We are the inheritors of a system we did not create and do not fully understand. We excavate the ruins, decode the inscriptions, and study the alignments. We think we are uncovering the past, but we are also maintaining the present. We are keeping the records. We are ensuring continuity, just as the Maya did, just as someone long ago taught them to do. The sky has not changed. The cycles have not stopped. The planetary alignments continue, predictable and precise, just as the Dresden Codex calculated centuries ago. And somewhere, in the darkness above, something is still watching, waiting for the next window, the next alignment, the next return. The Maya never said the gods would speak. They never said the gods would intervene. They only said the gods would return. And the calendar, still counting forward into a future we have yet to reach, says the same thing. They are coming back, not because they care, but because they have not finished observing, and we, like the Maya before us, are still here, watching the sky, keeping the schedule, maintaining the records, waiting. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dive investigations into the mysteries that keep us wondering. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Now let's get into something that might change how you think about what's beneath our feet. There's a single frame of VHS footage that refuses to leave my mind. A middle-aged man standing at a podium in Denver. The year is 1995. His hands shake slightly as he holds the microphone, but not from nervousness. These are the tremors of someone whose nervous system has been fundamentally damaged, whose body carries the physical evidence of trauma that most people couldn't survive. Behind him, a grainy projection shows geological cross-sections of northern New Mexico, layers of sediment and rock with annotations in his own handwriting. He's talking about underground bases, about things he claims to have seen with his own eyes. about a firefight that supposedly happened 16 years earlier in tunnels that officially don't exist. His name was Phil Schneider. The quality of the tape is terrible, degraded by time and multiple duplications, but you can still see the surgical scars on his hands where fingers used to be. You can still hear the conviction in his voice when he describes the smell of the tunnels, the sound of weapons fire echoing through chambers carved from living rock, the bodies of colleagues who never made it back to the surface. 1 year after this lecture, he would be found dead in his apartment in Wilsonville, Oregon, a catheter hose wrapped around his neck so tightly that it took considerable force. The official ruling: suicide. His hands, the same hands that were missing multiple fingers, allegedly managed to strangle himself with enough pressure to crush his larynx. The people who knew him said Phil Schneider was many things, but he wasn't suicidal. He was angry. He was determined. He was convinced that the public deserved to know what their government was doing in the deep places of the earth. But in that lecture, in that single moment captured on deteriorating magnetic tape, he says something that cuts through decades of conspiracy noise like a scalpel through flesh. He leans into the microphone and his voice drops to almost a whisper, as if he's afraid of being overheard even in a public venue. They're still there, under Archuleta Mesa, still working, still waiting. The camera wobbles, someone in the audience coughs. Phil Schneider's hands grip the podium, and for just a moment you can see something in his eyes that transcends fear. It's certainty. The absolute knowledge of someone who has seen something they can never unsee. This is the story of what happens when you decide to find out if he was telling the truth. This is the story of what happens when you look for a door that was never meant to be found. This is the Dulce Protocol. The Man Who Never Came Back, June 1979. The high desert of northern New Mexico bakes under relentless sun that turns the landscape into something alien and unforgiving. Phil Schneider, a former Los Alamos explosives technician with 17 years of experience in underground construction, stands at the edge of what will become the most controversial claim of his life. According to his later testimony, delivered in conference rooms and small venues across America in the mid-90s, he's part of a construction crew drilling into the mesa near the small town of Dulce. They're building something deep, something that requires specialized knowledge of underground detonation and structural engineering in extreme conditions. The project is classified. The workers don't know what they're building, only that it's important enough to warrant the presence of armed military personnel and security protocols that seem excessive for a simple construction job. Schneider was good at his work. He'd helped build underground facilities before, part of the vast network of hardened structures the US government constructed during the Cold War. Deep command bunkers, missile silos, facilities designed to survive nuclear war. He knew rock composition, load-bearing calculations, the precise amount of explosive needed to carve chambers from solid stone without causing catastrophic collapse. But on this particular day in June, something goes wrong. The drill bit, boring through layers of sedimentary rock and volcanic tuff, suddenly drops into empty space. The change in resistance is immediate and unmistakable. They've broken through into a cavity, a void that shouldn't exist according to the geological surveys. The crew pulls the bit back, and air rushes out of the hole. Not the stale, dead air of a sealed pocket, but moving air. Air that's been somewhere. According to Schneider's account, what happens next changes everything. They widen the hole, prepare to investigate. Standard procedure dictates caution, gas detection, structural assessment. But before they can complete their safety protocols, something comes through from the other side. The official story, if there even is one, has been buried under layers of classification and deliberate confusion. Government documents related to the Dulce construction project from 1979 are still sealed, their very existence neither confirmed nor denied. But Schneider would spend the last years of his life telling anyone who would listen about what happened next, about the tunnel they found, already excavated, showing evidence of construction methods that didn't match any human engineering he recognized, about the entities they encountered, beings, that didn't respond to verbal commands or warning shots the way humans would, about the firefight that erupted when security forces arrived and attempted to assert control, about the beams of light that cut through rock and flesh with equal ease, about the screaming that echoed through chambers that went deeper than their maps suggested possible. Schneider claimed that 67 people died that day: military personnel, construction workers, security contractors. He said he survived only because a Green Beret allegedly threw him away from one of the directed energy weapons the entities were using, taking the fatal blast himself. Schneider's hands told their own story: missing fingers, burned scars, nerve damage so extensive that he struggled with fine motor control for the rest of his life. His medical records, the ones he shared publicly, documented radiation exposure inconsistent with any civilian source. His disability claim cited injuries sustained in the line of duty during classified operations, language carefully chosen to reveal nothing while confirming something happened. Fast forward to 2021. Elias Ford sits in his cramped graduate student apartment in Los Angeles, the blue glow of his laptop screen illuminating stacks of research papers about government transparency, press freedom, and the limits of FOIA requests. Empty coffee cups form a small mountain on his desk. His thesis advisor's increasingly concerned emails sit unanswered in his inbox. His girlfriend stopped calling 3 weeks ago after one too many conversations that started with dinner plans and ended with theories about underground facilities. He's watching that Denver lecture for the 47th time, and he started keeping count because he's begun to notice things, small details, the way Schneider's left eye twitches when he mentions specific dates, the way he grips the podium when describing the entities, the way his voice breaks, genuinely breaks, when he talks about the men who didn't make it out. Elias isn't a conspiracy theorist, at least not the kind who sees patterns in pizza restaurant logos, or believes in shape-shifting reptilians running world governments. He's methodical, trained in verification and source analysis, taught to follow evidence wherever it leads, and to trust documentation over speculation. His undergraduate work in investigative journalism earned him awards. His professors called him unusually rigorous in his approach to research. But something about Schneider's testimony gnaws at him with the persistence of a splinter working its way deeper under the skin. It's not what the man says, it's how he says it. The specific details, the technical language that rings true to anyone who knows construction and engineering. The way he references real places, real agencies, real protocols. The way his voice cracks when he describes the smell of ozone and burnt flesh. A description so visceral and specific that it feels like sense memory rather than fabrication. People who lie tend to embellish. They add dramatic details, create heroic narratives, paint themselves as central figures in grand conspiracies. Schneider's account is almost clinically spare. He doesn't claim to understand what he encountered. He doesn't pretend to have special knowledge of alien civilizations or government conspiracies. He simply describes what he says he experienced in the language of a construction worker who found something he wasn't supposed to find. And then there's the death. January 7th, 1996. Phil Schneider found dead in his apartment after being missing for several days. The autopsy report, publicly available, notes the catheter hose wrapped around his neck with enough force to crush the hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage. The medical examiner ruled it suicide, but Elias has read that autopsy report a dozen times, and the details bother him. Schneider's hands, already damaged and missing fingers, would have struggled to generate the force necessary for that kind of strangulation. The positioning of the ligature suggested pressure applied from behind and above, awkward for self-infliction. There were no drugs in his system, no alcohol, nothing to suggest impaired judgment or suicidal ideation. Friends and family insisted Schneider was preparing for more lectures. He had bookings scheduled. He was working on a presentation about government black budgets. He told multiple people he had more information to share, documents he was still organising. Then he was dead, and the narrative shifted from whistleblower to troubled man who took his own life. Elias makes a decision that will unravel his life, though he doesn't know it yet. He's going to find out what really happened at Dulce. He's going to treat this like a real investigation, following evidence, tracking down sources, building a case that can withstand scrutiny. He's going to assume Schneider was telling the truth and see where that assumption leads. It's 2 a.m. when he creates a new folder on his laptop, Dulce Protocol. Inside, he begins cataloguing everything he can find. Schneider's lectures, transcribed word for word, geological surveys of the Archuleta Mesa region, historical records of construction projects in northern New Mexico during the late 70s, news articles about cattle mutilations, reports of UFO sightings, missing person cases. The coffee goes cold as he works. Outside his window, Los Angeles sleeps, and somewhere in New Mexico, beneath a mesa that rises from high desert like a monument to secrets, machinery hums in tunnels that officially don't exist. Elias doesn't sleep that night. He's crossed a threshold, made a commitment to a path that will consume him. In the morning he'll start making calls. He'll reach out to witnesses, researchers, anyone who might remember the events of 1979. But for now, he watches the lecture one more time. Phil Schneider's damaged hands gripping the podium, his voice carrying the weight of truth that no one wants to hear. They're still there, under Archuleta Mesa, still working, still waiting. Waiting for what, Elias wonders, and more importantly, waiting for whom? Act 1. The history they don't talk about real-world origins. Every conspiracy theory has an origin point, a moment where documented reality blurs into speculation, where the solid ground of verifiable fact gives way to the quicksand of possibility. For Dulce, that moment begins not with a dramatic revelation, but with routine police work in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. October 1967. The town of Dulce, population roughly 2,000, sits in the high country of northern New Mexico like a secret the landscape is trying to keep. It's Jicarilla Apache Reservation land, a place of stunning vistas and deep cultural significance, where the modern world sits uncomfortably alongside traditions that stretch back centuries. The town itself is small, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the arrival of strangers is noticed and remembered. New Mexico State Police records from that October tell a story that doesn't fit comfortably into official narratives. Multiple officers, working different shifts, responding to different calls, all report the same thing. Lights in the sky near Archuleta Mesa, not distant aircraft lights or stars misidentified by unreliable witnesses. These are objects moving in patterns that violate basic physics as the officers understand it. Patrolman James Bustamante files a report on October 14th, describing an object that appeared stationary for 17 minutes before accelerating to impossible speed with no visible means of propulsion. His report is detailed, clinical, the work of a professional trying to document something that challenges his understanding of reality. He notes wind conditions, visibility, the presence of his partner as a corroborating witness. He sketches the object's flight path and estimates its size relative to known landmarks. 3 days later, Sergeant Maria Sanchez reports a similar sighting from a different location. Then Officer Thomas Whitehorse. Then others. The reports accumulate in files that will sit in archives for decades, neither investigated nor explained, simply recorded and filed away under classifications that ensure they won't be casually discovered. These aren't anonymous reports from unreliable witnesses claiming they were abducted or probed. These are sworn law enforcement officials filing paperwork that could affect their careers and credibility, documenting something they can't explain but can't deny they witnessed. The sightings continue sporadically over the next several years. Sometimes months pass between reports. Sometimes multiple sightings occur within days. The pattern is inconsistent enough to resist easy explanation, but persistent enough to establish that something unusual is happening in the airspace around Archuleta Mesa. Then comes the cattle mutilation wave, and the strangeness takes on a darker character. Between 1975 and 1979, ranchers across northern New Mexico report something that transforms the region from mysterious to actively frightening. Cattle found dead in fields, their bodies surgically altered with precision that baffles veterinarians and law enforcement alike. The cases share disturbing commonalities that suggest systematic rather than random events. The animals are found drained of blood, their bodies showing no signs of bloating or decomposition that would normally occur within hours of death. Organs are removed through incisions so clean they appear to be made with surgical instruments far more precise than any farmer or veterinarian in the region possesses. Eyes excised with circular cuts, tongues removed through the jaw, reproductive organs extracted with what forensic veterinarians describe as laser-like precision. No blood pools around the bodies, no tracks approach or leave the carcasses, no signs of predation, no evidence of scavengers. Just the bodies, arranged in ways that seem almost deliberate, as if left as messages or warnings. Local veterinarian Thomas Chen examines dozens of these animals between 1976 and 79. His reports, preserved in county records and later obtained through FYA requests, note details that defy conventional explanation. Hemoglobin levels in remaining tissue suggest rapid exsanguination, but there's no blood at the scene. Incision edges show heat damage at the cellular level, consistent with cauterization by directed energy rather than cutting by blade. In several cases, bones appear to have been softened or partially dissolved to allow organ removal through impossibly small openings. These are not predator kills, Chen writes in a report dated March 1978. These are not the work of cultists or pranksters. The precision and methodology suggest technology and knowledge beyond what any civilian operation would possess. I have no explanation that satisfies the evidence. In March of 1979, the phenomenon reaches a crescendo. Local rancher Manuel Gomez discovers 17 mutilated cattle on his property over a span of 8 days. The animals represent a significant portion of his herd, thousands of dollars in losses that insurance refuses to cover, because no one can determine the cause of death. Gomez is the third generation of his family to work this land. He knows cattle. He knows predators. He knows what natural death looks like. What he finds in his fields is something else entirely. He calls the sheriff. He calls the state police. He calls federal authorities. A team from the FBI's Albuquerque field office arrives to investigate, part of a broader multi-state effort to understand the cattle mutilation phenomenon that's been terrorizing ranchers across the Southwest. The FBI reports, later released through FOI gay requests after decades of classification, make for disturbing reading. Special agents document incision patterns, tissue samples, the complete absence of forensic evidence that would normally accompany either human or animal predation. They interview ranchers, veterinarians, local law enforcement. They consult with pathologists and forensic specialists. Their conclusions are carefully worded, written in the bureaucratic language designed to convey information without making inflammatory statements. But one phrase appears 17 times across multiple reports, always in quotes, as if the agents writing the reports want to distance themselves from the implications. Cutting instruments of unknown origin. Unknown origin. Not advanced surgical tools, not specialized equipment. Unknown origin, as if the FBI, with all its resources and expertise, cannot identify what created these precise, cauterized incisions in dead cattle across the American Southwest. The mutilation wave creates a climate of fear in rural New Mexico. Ranchers start keeping their cattle closer to their homes. People install lights, motion sensors, cameras. Some organize armed patrols. The economic impact is substantial, but the psychological impact is greater. This is a region where people pride themselves on self-reliance, on understanding their land and its dangers. But how do you defend against something you can't identify, that leaves no evidence, that operates with technology you don't understand? Then, in 1980, the story takes another turn with the introduction of Paul Benowitz. Benowitz was a physicist and inventor, who ran Thunder Scientific Corporation in Albuquerque, a successful business that manufactured precision instruments for measuring humidity and temperature. He held patents, he had government contracts, he'd done work for classified programs. This wasn't a crank or a paranoid recluse. This was a respected member of the scientific community with security clearances and a reputation for rigorous, methodical work. He lived near Kirtland Air Force Base, home to numerous sensitive operations and one of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons facilities. His house sat on a hill with a clear view of the base's remote sections, areas where unusual activity sometimes occurred after dark. Being a scientist and an inventor, Benowitz had equipment, radio receivers, recording devices, cameras with telephoto lenses. He was curious by nature and by profession, the kind of person who notices patterns and wants to understand their underlying causes. In 1980, he began intercepting strange radio signals. Benowitz was experienced with radio technology. He understood frequency allocation, transmission protocols, the characteristic signatures of different types of communications equipment. What he was receiving didn't match anything in his experience. Low-frequency transmissions, pulsed in patterns that suggested data transfer rather than voice communication, coming from a bearing that pointed northeast of Albuquerque. He triangulated the signals using multiple receivers at different locations. The source appeared to be somewhere in the direction of Dulce, New Mexico, approximately 120 miles away, in the vicinity of Archuleta Mesa. Benowitz did what any responsible scientist would do. He documented everything meticulously. He recorded the signals, he analysed their patterns, he created maps showing the apparent source location. He compiled his findings into a detailed report, and then he did something that would change his life irrevocably. He approached the Air Force with his findings. You have to understand the context. This is 1980. The Cold War is still very much active. The Soviet Union represents an existential threat. Kirtland Air Force Base is a strategic facility housing nuclear weapons and conducting classified research. An experienced physicist and defense contractor reporting unusual signals in the vicinity of sensitive installations would normally be taken seriously, and they did take him seriously, but not in the way Benowitz expected. What happened next is documented fact, confirmed by declassified documents and later admissions by intelligence officials. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations didn't investigate Benowitz's claims. They investigated Benowitz himself, and then they began one of the most elaborate and sustained psychological operations ever conducted against a private US citizen. They fed him disinformation. They encouraged his most paranoid theories. They provided him with forged documents suggesting underground bases and alien technology. They sent agents posing as fellow researchers to feed him elaborate stories. They monitored his communications, his movements, his mental state. Over several years, they systematically destroyed Paul Benowitz's grip on reality. By the mid-80s, Benowitz was hospitalized for psychological treatment. His business suffered. His family relationships fractured. The brilliant physicist who'd held security clearances and government contracts became known as a delusional conspiracy theorist. His legitimate findings about unusual signals drowned in a sea of false information fed to him by the very people he'd tried to help. Benowitz died in 2003. His reputation never fully recovered. And the question that haunts his story, the question that draws researchers like Elias decades later, is simple. Why would the US Air Force devote years of resources and sophisticated psychological warfare techniques to discrediting one man unless he'd actually found something they needed to keep hidden? Elias begins digging. Elias's investigation begins with phone calls to people who don't want to remember, to people who've spent decades trying to forget, to people who made peace with burying the truth so deeply that excavating it feels like a violation. Manuel Gomez died in 2003, his final years marked by declining health and a reluctance to discuss the events of '79. But his daughter, Rosa Gomez Martinez still lives on the family ranch, maintaining the land her grandfather cleared and her father expanded. When Elias reaches her after 3 weeks of trying to track her down, there's a long pause after he introduces himself and his research topic. He can hear her breathing on the other end of the line, can hear the sound of wind through an open window, that high desert wind that never really stops, can hear her considering whether to hang up or speak. "Nobody's asked about that in 20 years, she says finally. Her voice carries the weight of memories she's tried to bury, trauma inherited and personal. My father saw things that broke him. He was a practical man, raised cattle for 40 years before those months changed everything." Rosa describes her father's transformation after the mutilations, how he went from a confident, self-assured rancher to someone who checked the locks 3 times before bed. How he installed floodlights all around the property, turning night into something approximating day, the electricity bills becoming prohibitive but preferable to darkness. How he started sleeping with a loaded .30-06 rifle beside his bed, the safety off, his hand resting on the stock even in sleep. He would stand on the porch at night, Rosa continues, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, as if the phone line itself might be monitored. Just stand there for hours, watching the mesa, watching the sky. I'd wake up at 2, 3 in the morning, and he'd be out there in his robe, perfectly still, just watching. She tells Elias about the nights when the cattle would go silent. Not the normal quiet of sleeping animals, but an eerie, absolute silence that felt wrong on a cellular level. Her father would notice it immediately, would grab his rifle and his flashlight and go out into the fields, searching for whatever was spooking his herd. Sometimes he'd find nothing. The cattle would be standing motionless, awake but frozen, as if paralysed by fear or something else. Other times he'd find them the next morning, the mutilated ones, the ones that had been alive at evening check but were dead by dawn, their bodies altered in ways that denied explanation. He used to tell me, "They come at night, mija. They come when the dogs won't bark." The dogs. Rosa's voice breaks slightly when she mentions them. Multiple ranchers reported the same phenomenon. Their dogs, normally aggressive protectors of livestock, would fall silent before mutilation events, not cowering or hiding, but simply standing still, as if their instinct to bark and defend had been switched off like a light. Rosa's own dog, a German shepherd named Lobo, who would bark at coyotes half a mile away, stood silent on the porch the night 7 more cattle were found mutilated in the south pasture. Just stood there, looking toward the mesa, body rigid, not making a sound. My father never recovered from those months, Rosa says. Even after the mutilation stopped, even after things went back to what everyone called normal, he was never the same. He'd wake up screaming sometimes, nightmares about things watching from above, about lights that moved with intention, about feeling helpless on his own land. She agrees to meet Elias, but only after making him promise he won't use her full name, won't identify the specific location of her ranch, won't include details that might make her family identifiable. There are still consequences, she suggests, for talking too openly about what happened in '79. Elias flies to Albuquerque and drives north, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to open country to the dramatic mesas and valleys of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. He meets Rosa at a truck stop diner in Dulce, a place where they can talk without being overheard, but where their meeting won't seem unusual or noteworthy. She's in her mid-50s, with her father's strong features and eyes that carry the wariness of someone who's learned that truth is often unwelcome. She brings a box of her father's papers, photographs of mutilated cattle, veterinary reports, insurance claim forms that were rejected, correspondence with law enforcement agencies that never led anywhere. The photographs are difficult to look at. Elias has seen crime scene photos before, has looked at images of violence and death as part of his journalism training, but these images are different. The precision of the mutilations, the absence of any evidence of struggle, the almost surgical quality of the alterations, all of it suggests something beyond human capability or animal predation. The FBI came, Rosa says, spreading documents across the diner table. Spring of '79, 2 agents, very professional, very thorough. They walked the fields, they examined the bodies, they took tissue samples, they interviewed my father for hours. She produces a copy of their report obtained years later through an FOIA request. The language is careful, clinical, designed to document without concluding. But reading between the bureaucratic phrasing, Elias can see the agents' confusion. They can't explain what they're seeing. They can attribute the mutilations to neither human nor animal causes. They note the absence of evidence that should be present and the presence of evidence that shouldn't exist. They told my father they'd be in touch, Rosa continues. They said they were pursuing multiple lines of investigation across several states. Then nothing, no follow-up, no answers. Like they documented everything and then just stopped. Elias asks if her father ever speculated about what was responsible. Rosa's expression darkens. He knew, she says quietly, or thought he did. Toward the end of his life, when he'd been drinking, he'd talk about it. About lights he saw moving low over the fields. About sounds he heard. Mechanical sounds that didn't match any aircraft or vehicle he knew. About feeling watched, not by people, but by something else. Something studying him like he was an experiment. She tells Elias her father became convinced the mutilations were connected to something operating out of Archuleta Mesa. He'd driven up there, hiked some of the accessible trails, talked to Apache elders who warned him away. They told him the mesa was bad land, that their people avoided it, that there were places where the earth felt wrong and the air tasted like metal. Before Rosa leaves, she places her hand on Elias's, the same gesture her father would use when he needed someone to really listen. My father died never knowing what happened to his cattle, she says, but he died believing it was real, that it was deliberate, and that whoever or whatever was responsible didn't care about him or his animals except as subjects. That helplessness, that knowledge that he couldn't protect what was his, that's what broke him. Not the financial loss, the powerlessness. Elias tracks down 3 researchers who met with Paul Benowitz in the early 80s, before his breakdown, when he was still coherent and methodical in his claims. Each lives in a different parts of the country now. Each left New Mexico decades ago. Each tells a similar story about a brilliant man who became increasingly unstable, though they disagree on whether his instability was organic or induced. The first is Leonard Stringfield, a former Air Force intelligence officer turned UFO researcher who met Benowitz in 1981. They talk via video call, Stringfield now in his late 70s, speaking from his home in Ohio. Paul was brilliant, Stringfield says, his face filling the screen, lined with age but his eyes still sharp. Absolutely brilliant. The first time I met him, he walked me through his data like he was presenting at a scientific conference. Frequency analysis, signal intercepts, directional triangulation. This wasn't some amateur with a radio scanner. This was professional grade work. Stringfield describes visiting Benowitz's home laboratory, seeing the equipment set up, the meticulous records. Benowitz had invested tens of thousands of dollars in radio monitoring equipment. He'd developed software for signal analysis years before such tools became common. He approached the mystery like an engineering problem to be solved. But something happened between 81 and 84, Stringfield continues, his expression troubled. Paul started making claims that went beyond what his data supported. He started talking about alien bases and genetic experiments. The methodical scientist became the paranoid theorist, and it happened fast. Too fast. The second researcher, Angela Morrison, is more direct in her assessment. She's a physicist who worked with Benowitz on consulting projects in the late 70s, before any of the UFO research began. They broke him, she states flatly over the phone, her voice carrying absolute conviction. The Paul Benowitz I knew would never have descended into the paranoid ramblings he became known for without external pressure. Someone fed him disinformation systematically and deliberately. Morrison tells Elias about watching Benowitz change, how he became increasingly agitated, how he started seeing patterns that weren't there, how he began trusting sources that, in retrospect, were obviously feeding him false information designed to discredit everything he'd legitimately discovered. The Air Force admitted it later, Morrison says. They admitted running operations against Paul, but they framed it as protective, as trying to steer a civilian away from sensitive installations. That's not what it was. It was character assassination through psychological manipulation. The third researcher refuses to speak on record, but agrees to an off-the-record conversation. He's a former NSA analyst who worked signals intelligence in the Southwest during the early 80s. He won't confirm or deny specific operations, but he provides context that makes Elias's blood run cold. Paul Benowitz intercepted real signals, the analyst says. I can't tell you what they were or where they originated, but the response he received, the level of attention directed at him, that tells you everything you need to know. We don't run multi-year psychological operations against private citizens who've stumbled onto nothing. The analyst explains how these operations work, how you identify someone who's found something sensitive, then feed them a mixture of truth and fiction until they can no longer distinguish between them. How you encourage their most extreme theories while systematically discrediting them publicly. How you transform a credible witness into a cautionary tale. The goal isn't to silence them, the analyst explains. The goal is to make them silence themselves by destroying their own credibility. Paul Benowitz did more damage to his own claims than any government denial ever could, because by the end, everything he said sounded crazy, including the parts that were true. Elias's most disturbing interviews come from Navajo and Apache locals who've lived near Dulce for generations, whose connection to the land predates American sovereignty, predates Spanish colonization, predates the written history that treats this region as discovered when Europeans arrived. They speak carefully, as if the land itself might be listening, as if speaking too openly about certain things might draw attention better left avoided. Several refuse to speak at all. Others agree only to talk off record, their words documented in Elias's notebooks but not recorded, their names replaced with descriptions. Elderly man, former Apache tribal council, member or woman, mid-60s traditional healer. Marie Sosi is different. She agrees to speak on record, tells Elias to use her name, says she's too old to care about consequences anymore. She's 78, a grandmother and great-grandmother, with family roots in the region going back so many generations that the exact count has been lost to time. They meet at a diner in Dulce, the same one where Elias met Rosa. Marie arrives exactly on time, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body has been worn down by decades of hard living but whose mind remains sharp. She orders coffee. She doesn't drink and speaks in a voice barely above a whisper, forcing Elias to lean close to hear her over the ambient noise of the diner. My people have stories about Archuleta Mesa that go back centuries, she begins, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup for warmth despite the summer heat outside. We call it different names in Apache. The closest translation is the place where the earth breathes, or the place of deep voices. Marie explains that in traditional Apache cosmology, certain locations are considered powerful, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin. Archuleta Mesa is one of these places, but not in a benevolent sense. There are caves, she continues, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the diner walls as if seeing the landscape in her mind. Tunnels that go deep. My grandfather told me stories his grandfather told him about warriors who went into those caves and came back changed. Some didn't come back at all. When Elias asks what changed means, Marie takes a long moment before answering. Their minds, she says finally. They would see things that weren't there or stop seeing things that were. They would speak in voices that didn't sound like themselves. They would know things they shouldn't know and forget things they should remember. We learned, over generations, to avoid those caves, to mark them as forbidden, to teach our children that some darkness is meant to remain unexplored. She slides a piece of paper across the table. On it are names and dates written in careful handwriting. 12 entries, spanning from 1982 to 2015. Missing people, Marie says quietly. Hikers, hunters, tourists, people who went into the area around Archuleta Mesa and never came out. The Forest Service says it's the terrain. The Bureau of Land Management says people get lost. They organise searches, use helicopters and dogs, and they find nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of where these people went. She tells Elias about her cousin, Benjamin Sosi, who worked search and rescue for 15 years. Benjamin was skilled at tracking, at reading the landscape, at finding people who didn't want to be found. He participated in searches for 6 of the names on Marie's list. He told me once, after he retired, that they were told to avoid certain areas during searches, Marie says, her voice dropping even lower. Grid coordinates marked off limits by federal authorities. No explanation given, just orders that certain zones were not to be entered by search teams, even if tracks or evidence pointed in those directions. Benjamin died in 2018, but before his death he told Marie something that still haunts her. He said on one search, in 2007, they found a camp, tent, supplies, equipment, fresh food, nothing disturbed, like the person had just stepped away. But there were no tracks leading from the camp, no signs of where they'd gone, just the camp, perfectly preserved, and no person. The missing person from that search, a 28-year-old geologist named Sarah Chen conducting soil surveys, was never found. Her family eventually held a memorial service without a body. The official conclusion was that she likely fell into a ravine or crevice, and her remains were unrecoverable. But Benjamin told Marie there were no ravines or crevices within 2 miles of that camp. The geology didn't support that explanation. It was as if Sarah Chen had simply ceased to exist mid-activity, leaving her belongings behind as the only evidence she'd been there at all. Before Marie leaves, she places her hand on Elias's. Her skin is warm despite the cold coffee cup she'd been holding, and her grip is surprisingly strong. They hear things under the ground, she says, her dark eyes holding his with an intensity that allows no room for dismissal. Machinery where no machinery should be. Voices that sound human but use words that make no sense. Lights in the caves that move with purpose. My people have heard these things for longer than the United States has existed. She stands, gathering her bag, preparing to leave. But she pauses, looking down at Elias with an expression that might be pity or might be resignation. The white people who came to this land, they didn't believe our warnings about the mesa. They thought we were primitive, superstitious. Then they went digging, and they found what we have always known was there. The difference is we respected it, avoided it, survived by keeping our distance. They tried to control it. That's the mistake that changes everything. Marie walks out of the diner into the bright New Mexico sunlight. Elias watches her go, his recorder still running, the list of names still on the table before him. 12 people, 12 disappearances, 12 families with questions that will never be answered, and beneath it all, under tons of rock and earth, machinery humming in places where no machinery should exist. Act 2. The government connection declassified hints. Elias spends 3 months buried in FOIA requests and declassified documents, transforming his apartment into something between a research archive and a conspiracy theorist's lair. His walls are covered with printouts, timelines, maps with pins connected by red string. His thesis. Advisor stops returning his emails. His funding situation becomes precarious. Friends start avoiding his calls. But he can't stop because what he's finding isn't smoking gun proof of underground alien bases, but something almost more disturbing, evidence of systematic misdirection and unexplained government activity concentrated around a single remote location with no obvious strategic value. The FOIA requests yield results slowly, each document arriving with heavy redactions, black bars obscuring names, dates, operational details. But even redacted, the documents tell a story. Air Force OSI memos from 1982, their headers stamped with classification levels that should have expired decades ago, discuss what they call Bennewitz activity and containment protocols. The language is bureaucratic but telling. They're not investigating whether Bennewitz's claims have merit. They're containing him, managing the problem he represents. One memo, dated September 1982, outlines a strategic disinformation campaign designed to redirect subjects' research focus toward non-sensitive areas while maintaining subjects' belief in primary hypothesis. In plain language, feed Bennewitz false information about aliens to distract him from whatever he'd actually found. But here's what keeps Elias awake at night. Why would a private citizen investigating radio signals require containment protocols? You don't deploy strategic disinformation campaigns against someone who's chasing nothing. You ignore them, or you politely correct them, or you send them a cease and desist letter if they're trespassing on secure frequencies. You don't wage psychological warfare against them unless they've found something real. NSA documents released in 2015, part of a broader transparency initiative that nobody paid much attention to, show surveillance orders for radio interception in the Dulce area between 1980 and 1984. The stated purpose is redacted. The target of the surveillance is redacted. The results of the surveillance are redacted. But the resource allocation is visible. Dedicated monitoring stations, specialized equipment, trained personnel assigned for 4 continuous years. Elias does the math. The cost of maintaining that level of surveillance in a remote area with minimal population would run into millions of dollars. For what? To monitor radio signals in the middle of nowhere? To watch a handful of ranchers and a small Apache community? The disproportion between resources expended and official explanation offered suggests something significant enough to warrant sustained, expensive attention. Then there are the FBI reports on the cattle mutilation phenomenon, obtained through multiple FOIA requests and cross-reference with state police records and veterinary reports. The documents span from 1975 through 1984, hundreds of pages documenting mutilation events across New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Montana. The reports are clinical, detailed, increasingly frustrated. FBI agents and forensic veterinarians document tissue samples showing thermal cutting effects, inconsistent with predation or known surgical tools. One report from a veterinary pathologist at New Mexico State University, dated April 1979, is particularly unsettling. The pathologist, a specialist in forensic animal medicine with 23 years of experience, describes examining a mutilated cow from the Gomez Ranch. He notes hemoglobin distribution patterns suggesting rapid exsanguination through unknown means, possibly vacuum extraction. The incision edges show cellular damage consistent with temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, but there's no burning or charring of surrounding tissue, as if the heat was impossibly focused, more precise than any cutting tool available to veterinary or surgical medicine at the time. The level of precision observed, the pathologist writes, exceeds the capabilities of even the most sophisticated surgical facilities. The absence of forensic evidence that should accompany either human perpetrators or animal predators suggests a methodology outside my professional experience and knowledge. A FBI summary report from 1980 attempts to draw conclusions from hundreds of documented cases. The report notes that despite extensive investigation, including laboratory analysis, field interviews, and consultation with medical and veterinary experts, no definitive explanation can be offered for the observed mutilation phenomena. The precision of the alterations and the absence of conventional forensic evidence preclude standard explanatory frameworks. Then, buried in a footnote, a single sentence that Elias highlights and photographs and stores in multiple locations. Tissue analysis conducted at Federal Facility Omega-7 indicates possible exposure to directed energy sources of unknown configuration. Federal Facility Omega-7, Elias searches every database he can access. The designation appears nowhere else in publicly available documents. It's a ghost reference, a hint of infrastructure that officially doesn't exist. But the psychological operations angle is what truly disturbs him, because it's documented, admitted, and still partially classified. Declassified documents confirm that from 1977 to 1981, Air Force intelligence ran active measures against Paul Benowitz under a program codenamed Desert Shepherd. They fed him false information about underground bases and alien technology. They created forged documents suggesting elaborate conspiracies. They encouraged his beliefs while systematically destroying his credibility. They monitored his mental health deterioration with the detached precision of scientists observing an experiment. One memo, written by an Air Force psychologist in 1983, assesses Benowitz's psychological state and recommends continued reinforcement of constructed narratives to maintain subjects' focus on non-operational areas. The memo notes that Benowitz is approaching critical psychological threshold, but recommends maintaining current operational tempo unless subject presents danger to himself or others. They knew they were destroying him. They documented his deterioration. They made calculated decisions about how far to push before his mental collapse might create unwanted attention. And they did it all in the service of protecting something near Dulce, New Mexico. Elias files FOIA requests for the files that remain classified, the documents that should have been automatically declassified decades ago under standard protocols. His requests are carefully worded, specific, citing exact statutes and precedents. He's learned the language of FOIA law, the magic phrases that theoretically compel disclosure. Each request comes back denied. The denials follow a template. The requested documents, if they exist, would contain information that could reasonably be expected to cause damage to national security if disclosed. The information remains properly classified under Executive Order 1295 and is exempt from disclosure under FOIA Exemption 1. But here's the thing that makes Elias's hands shake as he reads these denials. The exemption claims relate to ongoing operations and current intelligence activities. Ongoing operations, current activities. In reference to events from 40 plus years ago, in reference to a psychological operation against a man who died nearly 2 decades ago, in reference to cattle mutilations and UFO sightings that the official narrative dismisses as mass hysteria and mundane phenomena. If it's all nonsense, if there's nothing to hide, why are documents from the late 70s and early 80s still classified in 2021? What are they still protecting? Elias creates timelines, cross-referencing dates of mutilation events with dates of signal intercepts reported by Benowitz, with dates of unusual seismic activity recorded by USGS monitors, with dates of military exercises in the region. Patterns emerge that could be coincidence or could be something else. Spikes in mutilation reports correlate with increases in radio signal intercepts. Both correlate with unexplained seismic events that show rhythmic patterns inconsistent with natural earthquakes. All 3 phenomena cluster around Archuleta Mesa with statistical significance that resists random explanation. Something is happening in that location. Something sustained, deliberate, and significant enough that the government devoted enormous resources to monitoring it, containing information about it, and destroying the credibility of anyone who got too close to understanding it. Elias compiles his findings into a timeline that stretches across his living room wall. 1967, first documented UFO sightings. 1975 through 79, cattle mutilation wave. 1980, Benowitz intercepts signals. 1980 through 84, government surveillance and psychological operations. 1995, Schneider gives Denver lecture. 1996, Schneider found dead. And beneath all of it, the constant presence of Archuleta Mesa, rising from the high desert like a monument to secrets the government has decided the public has no right to know. The anonymous contact. The encrypted message appears in Elias's inbox on a Tuesday morning in April 2022, arriving through an anonymous email service routed through servers in Iceland, Switzerland and Estonia. The sender's address is a string of random characters that will never be traceable. The message itself is brief, almost terse, written by someone who understands operational security and chooses every word with care. You're asking the right questions, you're looking in the wrong places, the base is real. Schneider was partially correct. Meet me. Instructions will follow if you're serious. Elias's first instinct is to delete it. This is how journalists get compromised, how careful researchers get led into traps, how people investigating sensitive topics end up discredited or worse. Anonymous contacts are the oldest trick in the information warfare playbook. Promise revelation, deliver misdirection, and document the target's gullibility for later exploitation. But something about the message's phrasing, its specificity about Schneider being partially correct rather than completely right or completely wrong, suggests someone with actual insider knowledge, someone who knows the full picture and recognises that Schneider's account, while genuine in parts, was incomplete or misunderstood in others. Elias responds with a test. How do I know you're not trying to Benowitz me? The reply comes within an hour. Paul's mistake wasn't investigating the signals. His mistake was trusting people who claim to be helping him. I'm not claiming to help you. I'm offering information. What you do with it is your choice. They negotiate the terms through layers of encryption. The contact insists on a public place, broad daylight, multiple exit points, no recording devices, no witnesses. They settle on the Santa Fe rail yard district during the Saturday farmers market, crowds of tourists and locals providing both cover and safety. The contact provides a detailed protocol. Elias should arrive at 10 in the morning, buy a coffee from a specific vendor, then walk the perimeter of the market counterclockwise. Someone will approach him. They'll speak for exactly 20 minutes, then part ways. No subsequent contact will be possible through the email channel. Elias spends the week before the meeting running through every scenario, every possible trap. He tells a friend where he's going, leaves detailed notes, and a safe deposit box sets up a dead man's switch that will release his research if he doesn't check in within 48 hours. He's probably being paranoid, but paranoia and caution become indistinguishable when investigating subjects where people have actually died under mysterious circumstances. The Santa Fe rail yard on a Saturday morning is exactly what the contact promised. Crowded, public, impossible to control or monitor completely. Tourists browse artisan crafts. Families buy fresh produce. Musicians play for donations. It's aggressively normal, the kind of setting where clandestine meetings seem absurd. Elias buys his coffee and begins his counterclockwise circuit. He's halfway through his first lap when a man falls into step beside him, matching his pace exactly. The approach is so casual, so natural, that anyone watching would think they're friends who just ran into each other. The man is in his mid-60s, trim and precise in his movements, dressed in the kind of nondescript outdoor wear that's universal in New Mexico. His eyes are what catch Elias's attention, sharp, constantly scanning, taking in everything while appearing to focus on nothing. These are eyes trained by decades of operational awareness, by work that requires noticing threats before they develop. Keep walking, the man says quietly. His voice is educated, with hints of East Coast upbringing softened by years in the Southwest. Don't look at me directly. We're having a casual conversation. We're old acquaintances catching up. He introduces himself only as Robert, though everything about the introduction suggests this isn't his real name. It's a working name, chosen for this specific interaction, meaningless beyond this context. They walk through the market, weaving between stalls, Robert's eyes constantly tracking their surroundings. He identifies potential surveillance with subtle shifts of his gaze. A man in a parked car who's been sitting too long without buying anything. A woman with a camera who's taking pictures of people rather than produce, angles that could conceal directional microphones. I worked at Sandia National Laboratories from 1976 to 2008. Robert begins, his voice low, but clear enough for Elias to hear over the market noise. Materials Engineering Division. We did contract work for multiple agencies. DOE, DOD, projects I couldn't discuss even with my security clearance, projects that appeared on budget spreadsheets as line items without descriptions. He describes a career spent in the shadow world between acknowledged government programs and black budget operations that officially don't exist. Working on materials for projects he wasn't allowed to know the purpose of, shipping specialised components to locations he wasn't permitted to visit, signing non-disclosure agreements that turned his work into something he couldn't discuss with family or friends. In 1983, I was part of a team designing composite materials for underground construction, Robert continues. They pause at a fruit stand examining apples while they talk. High-strength concrete with radiation shielding properties, acoustic dampening systems for containing sound in subterranean environments, biological containment seals designed for laboratories working with hazardous materials. The specifications, he explains, were unusual. The materials needed to function at depths exceeding 1,000 feet, in environments with specific temperature and humidity parameters, with redundant containment systems suggesting work with exceptionally dangerous substances. The requisition orders were tagged with a facility designation, Unit Delta 5, Robert says. That designation appeared on internal logistics documents, shipping manifests, budget allocations. But when I tried to find information about what Unit Delta 5 was or where it was located, I hit walls. Classified, need to know, above your clearance level. He tells Elias about becoming curious, the way engineers become curious when specifications don't make sense, when projects seem to violate standard protocols. He started paying attention to patterns, shipments going to the same redacted location, materials ordered in quantities suggesting large-scale construction, timelines that implied ongoing operations rather than single projects. The shipping addresses were always redacted in the documents I saw, Robert says. They've moved to a quiet section of the market, ostensibly admiring handmade pottery. But requisition forms from the Geological Survey Division weren't as carefully scrubbed. They included topographical coordinates for delivery locations. Those coordinates pointed to an area near Dulce, New Mexico. Robert explains what he believes the Dulce facility actually is, and his explanation is more disturbing for its mundanity than any alien conspiracy theory would be. He describes a multi-level underground installation with compartmentalized purposes, where workers on different levels never interact, where each section operates in isolation without awareness of the full scope. Level 1 through 3, that's standard military research, Robert says, his voice taking on the quality of someone who's rehearsed this explanation in his mind countless times. Black budget projects, weapons development, classified material storage, nothing exotic by Department of Defense standards. You could find similar facilities in Nevada, Utah, New Mexico. Underground installations designed to survive nuclear war, to protect critical research, to operate independent of surface infrastructure. He pauses to buy a jar of local honey, the transaction giving them a moment to ensure no one is paying attention to their conversation. Level 4 is psychological operations, Robert continues as they walk. Information warfare, strategic deception, the kind of work the Air Force was doing when they ran operations against Benowitz. They study how information spreads, how to contain leaks, how to discredit sources without making martyrs of them. His voice drops lower, forcing Elias to lean in slightly to hear. Level 5 is listed in some documents as a genetic research facility. The specific phrasing in a 1983 budget allocation I saw was interspecies compatibility studies, not cross-species, not comparative genetics. Interspecies, which implies comparison between species that have some reason to need compatibility assessment. Elias feels his skepticism fighting with the meticulous detail Robert provides. This isn't wild speculation. This is someone reciting from memory documents he's spent years thinking about. Documents that haunt him enough that he's risking this meeting despite obvious personal cost. And level 6, Elias asks, his voice steadier than he feels. Robert's expression darkens, and for the first time his careful surveillance of their surroundings falters as if the mention of level 6 pulls his attention inward. There are rumours, he says carefully. Personnel who worked the upper levels and heard things. Nightmare Hall, they called it. Supposed collaboration between human researchers and non-human entities working on genetic material exchange, hybrid development programs, compatibility testing for purposes no one would discuss. Before Elias can respond with the obvious objection, the reasonable dismissal of alien conspiracy theories, Robert pulls out a tablet computer from his bag. The motion is casual, as if he's just checking email or showing photos. But what appears on the screen is a document that makes Elias's breath catch. It's a geological survey map from 1968, stamped with Department of Interior seals and Bureau of Land Management authorization numbers. The document appears authentic, with a kind of degradation and period-appropriate formatting that's difficult to forge convincingly. It shows Archuleta Mesa and the surrounding area in topographical detail, but beneath the surface features annotations indicating hollow chambers, multiple levels of them marked in blue ink with dimensional annotations. The chambers show clear geometric organisation, regular spacing connecting passages. Natural cave systems don't form in these patterns. These are engineered spaces, marked on a map 4 years before anyone outside classified circles was talking about underground bases at Dulce. This survey was commissioned in '68, Robert says, zooming in on specific sections. 4 years before Schneider's alleged firefight, 8 years before the cattle mutilations, 12 years before Benowitz started intercepting signals. They knew what was under that mesa before any of the conspiracy theories existed. He highlights a section showing a large central chamber with multiple levels extending downward. The annotations indicate depths exceeding 1,500 feet, with reinforced ceiling structures and what appear to be vertical access shafts. The survey was classified immediately after completion, Robert continues. I only saw it because a clerical error in the document control system at Sandia briefly made it accessible to my clearance level in 1987. When I tried to access it again 3 days later, it was gone from the system, but I remembered it. I've spent 35 years remembering it. He uploads the document to an encrypted drive and provides Elias with access codes. A string of characters Elias immediately commits to memory and writes in multiple secure locations. I'm telling you this because what's happening there, whatever it is, the public has a right to know, Robert says, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who's made a difficult ethical choice. But I'm also warning you, the people running this operation, they don't make mistakes. If you keep digging, they'll know, and they'll respond. Not necessarily with violence or obvious intimidation, but with something more sophisticated. They'll manage you, study you, turn you into data that helps them refine their containment protocols. Robert checks his watch, notes that they've been talking for exactly 18 minutes. In 2 minutes, he'll walk away and this conversation will end. One more thing you should understand, he says as they make a final circuit past the vegetable stands. The psychological operation against Benowitz wasn't a failure. It was a wildly successful experiment. They learned how to destroy a credible witness without making him disappear, how to transform legitimate findings into conspiracy theories by feeding the source false information until truth and fiction became inseparable in his mind. Every operation since has used those techniques. Benowitz was the prototype. Everyone who's investigated Dulce since has been running variations of the same program. He stops walking, turns to face Elias directly for the first time. His eyes carry a weight of knowledge that seems almost burdensome. They're going to do it to you, Robert says quietly. They're probably already doing it. Every source you contact might be real, or might be feeding you disinformation. Every document you find might be authentic or might be planted. By the time you realise you can't trust your own research, you'll have discredited yourself so thoroughly that nothing you say will matter. That's the real genius of the system. They don't suppress the truth. They drown it in so much noise that no one can distinguish signal from static. Robert walks away through the farmers' market crowd, disappearing among the vendors and tourists. becoming just another figure browsing produce on a Saturday morning. Elias never sees him again. The email address stops working within an hour of their meeting. Every trace of their communication is wiped from servers that thought they kept permanent records. But Elias has the map. He has the coordinates. And he has a terrible certainty that everything Robert told him is true, which means everything that comes next is already anticipated, already planned for, already part of someone else's carefully designed response protocol. The question isn't whether he should stop. The question is whether continuing serves truth, or whether it makes him a willing participant in his own manipulation. He looks at the tablet, at the geological survey showing chambers that officially don't exist, and makes a choice that will define everything that follows. He's going to Dulce. Act 3. The Descent into Archuleta Mesa. Meeting the Others. October 2022. Elias's research has consumed nearly a year of his life. His thesis advisor has stopped returning his emails. His graduate funding's running out. Everyone who cares about him thinks he's lost perspective, but he can't stop. He drives northeast from Albuquerque, watching the landscape shift from city sprawl to high desert to the imposing mesas of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. Dulce sits in a valley, a small cluster of buildings dwarfed by the vast landscape and the looming presence of Archuleta Mesa. The town feels like it's watching him. Through local contacts, Elias arranges a meeting with Edmund Valdez, a former Jicarilla Apache tribal police officer who resigned abruptly in 1994 after 23 years of service. Edmund is now 71, living in a small house on the edge of Dulce proper. He invites Elias in with the wary hospitality of someone who's told his story before and not been believed. "You want to know about the night I stopped being a cop," Edmund says, pouring coffee with hands that still move with authority despite his age. "February 19th, 94. I responded to calls about earthquake sounds coming from under the mesa. Multiple witnesses, not tourists, locals, people who know the difference between thunder, drilling and something else." Edmund describes arriving at a trailhead near one of the old uranium mine entrances, long since officially sealed. The ground was vibrating. Not the rolling motion of an earthquake, but a steady rhythmic pulse, like massive machinery operating far below. We had seismographs at the station. They registered nothing, no earthquake, but I felt it through my boots. We all did. He shows Elias photographs, taken with a film camera, of scorch marks in cave systems near the mesa. The patterns are unusual, radiating outward from central points in ways that don't match lightning strikes or campfires. Then Edmund produces audio files, transferred from old cassette tapes to digital format. He plays one. It's the sound of deep, rhythmic humming, so low it's almost subsonic. Elias feels it in his chest as much as hears it. Recorded in 2003 by a geological survey team, Edmund explains. They were doing environmental impact studies, found this in one of the accessible caves, never released publicly. The team member who gave me this copy quit 6 months later. Wouldn't say why. But the most chilling evidence Edmund presents is a folder of missing person reports. Cases from 1981, 1989, 1992, all within a 15-mile radius of Archuleta Mesa. All officially unsolved. 2 were experienced hikers. One was a geologist, another was a journalist working on a story about land use conflicts on the reservation. The FBI came for 2 of these, Edmund says, tapping the folder. Took the files, the evidence logs, everything. Said it was part of a broader investigation. We never heard anything again. The families never got answers. Edmund walks Elias to the door as evening settles over Dulce. The mesa is a dark silhouette against the sunset. "I spent 23 years keeping people safe," he says quietly. "But there's a boundary out there, invisible but real. Inside that boundary I couldn't help anyone. Nobody could. After that night in 94, after feeling whatever was moving under that ground, I realised I was protecting people from the wrong things." He looks directly at Elias. "They run the base, not us. Remember that if you go looking." Breaking into the tunnel system. Elias spends 3 days hiking the area around Archuleta Mesa, ostensibly documenting the landscape, actually mapping old mine entrances against historical Bureau of Indian Affairs surveys from the 70s. He finds what he's looking for on the 4th day, a ventilation shaft, partially concealed by collapse and vegetation, that matches coordinates from a 1974 mining safety inspection report. The shaft is marked on old maps as sealed, but the seal is clearly compromised, broken from the inside based on how the concrete is fractured. He waits until after midnight. The moon is a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by without a flashlight. He's equipped with a small camera, a voice recorder, climbing gear, and a level of determination that overrides his better judgment. The shaft descends at a 40-degree angle. The walls show evidence of industrial drilling, clean and uniform. This wasn't natural cave formation. About 200 feet down, the shaft levels out into a horizontal tunnel. That's when Elias notices the air. It's moving. Not the stagnant air of a sealed mine, but a steady breeze coming from deeper in the complex. Conditioned air. Cool and filtered. He follows the airflow. The tunnel branches, connecting to what appears to be a much larger system. The walls here are reinforced with concrete and steel. There's infrastructure, ventilation ducts, electrical conduits, junction boxes with recent manufacture dates. This isn't abandoned, this is active. Elias moves deeper, his camera recording everything. The smell shifts, becoming chemical, antiseptic, like a hospital or a laboratory. The mechanical sounds grow louder. Pumps, air handlers, something that sounds like generators in the distance. He reaches a junction where 3 tunnels converge. On the wall is a faded sign, military standard font. Unit D5, Joint Genetic Operations Center. Authorized personnel only biosafety level 4 protocols in effect. His hands shake as he photographs the sign. JGOC, Joint Genetic Operations Center. Robert's information was accurate. Then he hears voices. Footsteps echoing from one of the adjacent tunnels. Multiple people moving with purpose. Elias retreats, but the complex branches and he's disoriented. He takes a wrong turn and finds himself in a wider corridor with LED lighting and a large steel blast door. The door is marked D5 Primary Access. Security cameras rotate on mounts. Alarms begin to sound. Elias runs, adrenaline overriding thought. He crashes through the tunnel system, scraping against walls, his camera banging against his chest. He can hear pursuit behind him, coordinated and professional. He finds a side passage, squeezes through, emerges into what looks like a natural cave system. The sounds of pursuit fade. He climbs, finding another shaft, pulling himself up through darkness and panic until he emerges into cold night air. He doesn't stop running until he reaches his car, parked 3 miles away on a Forest Service road. He's violated federal property. He's documented classified infrastructure. He's crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The question now is what happens next. Act 4. The Capture and the Truth. Detained by unknown forces. Elias makes it 17 miles before the black SUVs force him off the road. It happens with professional efficiency. No sirens, no dramatic chase. Just 3 vehicles boxing him in on a remote stretch of highway near the Colorado border, their headlights turning night into day. Men in tactical gear, no insignia, weapons drawn but not pointed. They're calm, practiced. This isn't their first extraction. Step out of the vehicle, keep your hands visible. They search his car with systematic thoroughness. They find his camera, his notes, his laptop, his phone. Everything goes into evidence bags with alphanumeric designations. They find the GPS tracker he didn't know was attached to his undercarriage. "How long have you been following me?" Elias asks. No one answers. They transport him in a vehicle with blackout windows. He loses track of direction and time. When they finally stop and remove him, he's in an underground parking structure. Concrete, fluorescent lighting, the hum of ventilation systems. They take him to a room that's aggressively ordinary. Grey walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, a camera in the corner, its red light steady and unblinking. He sits there for 6 hours before anyone speaks to him. The 2 men who enter wear business casual clothing, the kind of nondescript professional attire that could belong to middle managers at any corporation. But their bearing is military. Intelligence. Community. They sit across from him, tablet computers in hand. "You entered a restricted federal facility," the first one says. No introduction, no badge. "You photographed classified infrastructure. You're facing charges under the Espionage Act." The Espionage Act. The same statute used against Snowden and Manning. Decades in federal prison. "I'm a journalist," Elias says, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm researching." "You're a graduate student with no press credentials investigating conspiracy theories," the second man interrupts. "You broke into a Department of Energy secure research facility. Your intentions are irrelevant. Your actions are prosecutable." They show him photographs on their tablets. Paul Benowitz in his workshop, looking gaunt and paranoid. Phil Schneider at that Denver lecture. 2 hikers who vanished in 2009, their faces smiling in photos that became missing person posters. Then a photograph of Elias himself climbing into the ventilation shaft. "You were in level 2, the first man says. "You saw signage for Unit Delta 5. You photographed infrastructure belonging to a joint operations centre. What you didn't see, what you couldn't have understood even if you had, is context." The second man leans forward. The facility under Archuleta Mesa is a collaborative research installation. It operates under joint oversight of the Department of Energy, the Air Force Directorate of Logistics, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Its work is classified, its very existence is classified, and people who compromise that classification face consequences. "Then charge me," Elias says. "Put me in front of a judge. Let me make my case public." They exchange a glance. Something passes between them, a decision made silently. "We're not going to charge you," the first man says. "You're going to be released." They let him go. The next 48 hours blur into a surreal nightmare of bureaucratic processing. They photograph him. They take his fingerprints. They have him sign documents he's not allowed to read completely, non-disclosure agreements with criminal penalties, waivers of rights he doesn't fully understand. They don't interrogate him about who he's talked to or what he knows. They don't seem concerned about his research. It's as if his entire investigation, everything he's done, is already known and already contained. On the morning of the 3rd day, they transport him again. This time, when the vehicle stops and the doors open, he's standing on a street corner in Santa Fe. Morning traffic, coffee shops, normalcy. His phone is gone. His camera is destroyed, handed back to him in a clear plastic bag, the memory card removed and the housing smashed. His car is nowhere to be found, and when he asks about it, the men simply point to a taxi waiting at the curb. "Your vehicle will be returned to your Los Angeles address within 2 weeks, one of them says. "Go home, resume your life, forget what you think you saw." They drive away, leaving him standing in the morning sun with nothing but the clothes on his back and a growing sense of unreality. He checks into a motel and tries to process what happened. They caught him in a restricted facility. They had every legal justification to prosecute him into oblivion. Instead, they released him with what amounts to a warning. Why? He searches his pockets, looking for his wallet, and finds something that wasn't there before. A small white card, unmarked except for a single line of text printed in black. "Stop digging. You were in level 2. There are 7. 7 levels. He made it to level 2. What's below?" Act 5. The information wore the cover-up machine. Back in Los Angeles, Elias tries to rebuild his research from memory. He creates new anonymous accounts. He begins posting what he knows on conspiracy forums, Reddit threads, anywhere people might listen. The posts disappear within hours, not removed by moderators, not flagged by users, simply gone, as if they never existed. His accounts get shadow banned. His IP address gets blocked. When he tries to contact journalists who cover national security issues, his emails bounce back or go unanswered. He's being suppressed systematically and efficiently. Desperate, he begins analysing historical data. He looks at online discussion trends around dull space over the past 2 decades. What he finds is disturbing. Discussion spikes occur in 3 distinct periods: 1999, 2012, and 2020. He cross-references these spikes with other data. In 1999, FEMA conducted large-scale disaster response exercises across New Mexico. The exercises involved underground rescue scenarios and lasted 3 weeks. In 2012, residents near Dulce reported unusual air traffic, military helicopters, unmarked cargo planes. The activity lasted for 2 months, then stopped abruptly. In 2020, the USGS recorded a series of small seismic events under Archuleta Mesa. The events showed unusual patterns, rhythmic rather than random, consistent with underground excavation or construction. Each spike in public interest coincides with increased activity at or around the Dulce site. Each time, the discussion gets loud, then gets quiet. Information gets shared, then disappears. It's a pattern, a cycle, as if someone is deliberately allowing information to surface, then systematically removing it, studying how far it spreads and who pays attention. Elias realizes he's not uncovering a conspiracy. He's participating in a study. The entire phenomenon, the leaks, the suppression, the cycle of revelation and concealment, it's managed. It's controlled. The conspiracy isn't the base. The conspiracy is the information warfare around it. The final confession. The message from Robert arrives 6 weeks after Elias's return to Los Angeles. It comes through the same encrypted channels, but this time there's an urgency to it. They know I've been talking to you. This is the last time. What I'm about to tell you is the truth, as far as I understand it. Whether you believe me is irrelevant. You deserve to know why they let you go. What follows is a narrative that Elias reads 3 times, each time hoping he's misunderstood. According to Robert, the Dulce facility wasn't built to experiment on anyone. It was built to facilitate an exchange. In 1954, the Eisenhower administration made contact with a non-human intelligence. This isn't speculation. This happened. The contact was managed through a series of intermediaries and resulted in an agreement. The terms of that agreement are above my clearance, but the implementation is not. Robert describes Dulce as one of several exchange facilities established in the late 50s and early 60s. The US provided access, infrastructure, and research collaboration. In return, they received technology and a guarantee of non-interference. The genetic research programs weren't about creating hybrids or conducting experiments. They were about compatibility studies, understanding biology different from ours. The exchange involved information, genetic material, research methodologies, both sides studying the other. Elias wants to dismiss this as insanity. But Robert's message continues with specific details that match too many pieces of his research. Paul Benowitz intercepted real signals. The Air Force destroyed him because he got too close to understanding the communication protocols. Phil Schneider was telling the truth about the firefight, but it wasn't an ambush. It was a containment breach. Security protocol failure. People died on both sides. Both sides. You stumbled into level 2, Robert's message continues. That's administrative and logistics. You saw the signage for joint genetic operations because that's where they process biological samples and conduct comparison studies. You didn't see level 5 or 6. Level 5 is where the actual exchange takes place. Level 6 is where they keep the agreements themselves, the contracts, the terms, the proof. Robert's final paragraph is a warning and an explanation. They let you go because you're not a threat. Your data, your investigation, your research patterns, your online behaviour, it all feeds into their analysis of information containment. They study how far someone can get, what they can find, how they respond to suppression. You think you were investigating them, they were studying you, and now that the study's complete, you're free to go about your life, knowing that anything you say will be dismissed as conspiracy theory, anything you prove will be deleted, and anyone you convince will be written off as delusional. The message ends with a single sentence. The truth isn't being hidden, it's being managed. Ending. The exit that isn't an exit, December 2022. Elias sits in his Los Angeles apartment, surrounded by the fragments of his investigation. His thesis is abandoned, his graduate funding is gone, his relationships are strained to breaking. But he has one thing left, the knowledge that he's right. The apartment has been searched. He knows this because small things are different. A book moved slightly, papers in a different order, the scratches around his door lock that weren't there before. His neighbours mention men in suits asking questions about him. Polite questions, official questions. He's being watched, assessed, catalogued. Elias makes a final decision. He uploads everything he can remember, everything he's reconstructed, to an encrypted site hosted in a country with strong digital privacy laws. He writes his testimony clearly and carefully, knowing it will be read by exactly 3 types of people. Those who already believe and need no convincing, those who will never believe regardless of evidence, and the analysts whose job is to monitor how this information spreads. His final words are chosen with precision. The dull space is real. I've seen it. I've walked its corridors. I've been detained and released by the people who run it. What's under level 6 isn't the problem, though I suspect it would reshape our understanding of reality. The real problem is how easily they made me stop talking about it. Not through threats, not through force, but through something more insidious. By making the truth indistinguishable from paranoia. By ensuring that anyone who speaks about this sounds exactly like someone who's lost their grip on reality. By creating a system where the evidence can exist in plain sight because nobody with credibility will touch it. They don't need to hide the truth anymore. They've made the truth hide itself. I know what I saw. I know what exists under Archuleta Mesa. And I know that by the time you read this, it won't matter. Because the mechanism designed to keep this secret isn't classification or suppression. It's something far more elegant. The certainty that anyone who talks about it will be dismissed as exactly what I sound like right now. There are 7 levels beneath the mesa. I made it to level 2. What's on the levels below is less important than the question of why we're not supposed to ask. What's being studied down there matters less than who agreed to let it be studied. What's being exchanged is secondary to the fact that an exchange is happening at all. They let me go because I'm not dangerous to them. I'm useful. Another data point, another case study in how far someone can dig before they're neutralised, not by violence or prosecution, but by the simple act of being made to sound crazy. So, here's my testimony. Believe it or dismiss it. Share it or forget it. Either way, underneath a mesa in New Mexico, there's a facility with 7 levels, and on those levels things are happening that we're not meant to understand. And the people who run it are counting on the fact that you'll never take this seriously enough to find out for yourself. Elias hits upload and watches the progress bar fill. His story joins thousands of others like it, indistinguishable from fiction, impossible to verify, easily dismissed. He closes his laptop and looks out at the Los Angeles skyline. Somewhere beneath the ground in New Mexico, machinery hums, research continues, agreements are honoured, and the world goes on, blissfully unaware or deliberately ignorant, he's no longer sure which. The truth isn't hidden, it's managed. And he's just become part of the management system, a cautionary tale about what happens when you dig too deep, packaged and presented in a way that ensures nobody else will make the same mistake. Elias Ford's investigation ends not with revelation, but with assimilation. He sought the truth. Instead, he became part of the mechanism that obscures it.